Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel, I narrate classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. I put notes in the video description with some background information on the authors and the stories if you'd like to read more, and you'll also find links to playlists and podcast series, as well as some compilation videos if you'd like a longer listen. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. My adventure in Norfolk. I don't know how it is with you, but during February my wife generally says to me, "Have you thought at all about what we are going to do for August?" And, of course, I say no, and then she begins looking through the advertisements of bungalows to let. Well, this happened last year, as usual, and she eventually produced one that looked possible. It said, Norfolk, Hickling Broad, furnished bungalow, garden, garage, boathouse, and all the rest of it. Oh, and plate and linen. It also mentioned an exorbitant rent. I pointed out the bit about the rent, but my wife said, "Yes, you'll have to go down and see the landlord and get him to come down. They always do." As a matter of fact, they always don't, but that's a detail. Anyway, I wrote off to the landlord and asked if he could arrange for me to stay the night in the place, to see what it was really like. He wrote back and said, certainly, and that he was engaging Mrs. So-and-so to come in and oblige me and make up the beds, and so forth. I tell you, we do things thoroughly in our family. I have to sleep in all the beds, and when I come home, my wife counts the bruises and decides whether they will do or not. At any rate, I arrived, in a blinding snowstorm, at about the most desolate spot on God's earth. I'd come to Potter Heigham by train and been driven on. It was a good 5 miles from the station. Fortunately, Mrs. Selston, the old lady who was going to do for me, was there, and she'd lighted a fire and cooked me a steak, for which I was truly thankful. I somehow think the cow, or whatever they get steaks off, had only died that morning. It was very, obstinate. While I dined, she talked to me. She would tell me all about an operation her husband had just had. All about it. It was almost a lecture on surgery. The steak was rather underdone, and it sort of made me feel I was illustrating her lecture. Anyway, she put me clean off my dinner, and then departed for the night. I explored the bungalow and just had a look outside. It was, of course, very dark, but not snowing quite so hard. The garage stood about 15 yards from the back door. I walked round it, but didn't go in. I also went down to the edge of the Broad and verified the boathouse. The whole place looked as though it might be all right in the summer-time, but just then it made one wonder why people ever wanted to go to the North Pole. Anyhow, I went indoors and settled down by the fire. You've no idea how quiet it was. Even the waterfowl had taken a night off. At least, they weren't working. At a few minutes to 11, I heard the first noise there'd been since Mrs. What's-her-name, Selston, had cleared out. It was the sound of a car. If it had gone straight by, I probably shouldn't have noticed it at all. Only it didn't go straight by. It seemed to stop farther up the road before it got to the house. Even that didn't make much impression. After all, cars do stop. It must have been 5 or 10 minutes before it was borne in on me that it hadn't gone on again. So I got up and looked out of the window. It had left off snowing, and there was a glare through the gate that showed that there were headlamps somewhere just out of sight. I thought I might as well stroll out and investigate. I found a fair-sized limousine pulled up in the middle of the road, about 20 yards short of my gate. The light was rather blinding, but when I got close to it, I found a girl with the bonnet open, tinkering with the engine. Quite an attractive young female, from what one could see, but she was so muffled up in furs that it was rather hard to tell. I said, "Good evening. Anything I can do?" She said she didn't know what was the matter. The engine had just stopped, and wouldn't start again. And it had. It wouldn't even turn, either with the self-starter or the handle. The whole thing was awfully hot, and I asked her whether there was any water in the radiator. She didn't see why there shouldn't be. There always had been. Well, this didn't strike me as entirely conclusive. I said we'd better put some in and see what happened. She said, why not use snow? But I thought not. There was an idea at the back of my mind that there was some reason why it was unwise to use melted snow, and it wasn't until I arrived back with a bucketful that I remembered what it was. Of course, goiter. When I got back to her, she'd got the radiator cap off and inserted what a Danish friend of mine calls a funeral. We poured a little water in. Luckily, I'd warned her to stand clear. The first tablespoon that went in came straight out again, red hot, and blew the funeral sky high. We waited a few minutes until things had cooled down a bit, but it was no go. As fast as we poured water in, it simply ran out again into the road underneath. It was quite evident that she'd been driving with the radiator bone dry, and that her engine had seized right up. I told her so. She said, "Does that mean I've got to stop here all night?" Well, I explained to her that it wasn't as bad as all that. That is, if she cared to accept the hospitality of my poor roof. And it was a poor roof. It let the wet in. But she wouldn't hear of it. By the by, she didn't know the circumstances, so it wasn't that. No, she wanted to leave the car where it was and go on foot. I said, "Don't be silly, it's miles to anywhere." However, at that moment we heard a car coming along the road, the same way as she'd come. We could see its lights too, although it was a very long way off. You know how flat Norfolk is. You can see a terrific distance. I said, "Well, there's the way out of all your troubles. This thing, whatever it is, will give you a tow to the nearest garage, or at any rate a lift to some hotel." One would have expected her to show some relief, but she didn't. I began to wonder what she jolly well did want. She wouldn't let me help her to stop where she was, and she didn't seem anxious for anyone to help her to go anywhere else. She was quite peculiar about it. She gripped hold of my arm and said, "What do you think this is that's coming?" I said, "Well, I'm sure I don't know, being a stranger in these parts, but it sounds like a lorry full of milk cans." I offered to lay her 6pence about it. This was before the betting tax came in. She'd have had to pay, too, because it was a lorry full of milk cans. The driver had to pull up, because there wasn't room to get by. He got down and asked if there was anything he could do to help. We explained the situation. He said he was going to Norwich, and was quite ready to give her a tow if she wanted it. However, she wouldn't do that, and it was finally decided to shove her car into my garage for the night, to be sent for next day, and the lorry was to take her along to Norwich. Well, I managed to find the key of the garage, and the lorry driver, Williams his name was, and I ran the car in and locked the door. This having been done, ablative absolute, I suggested that it was a very cold night, Williams agreed, and said he didn't mind if he did. So I took them both indoors, and mixed them a stiff whisky and water each. There wasn't any soda. And naturally the whole thing had left me very cold too. I hadn't an overcoat on. Up to now I hadn't seriously considered the young woman. For one thing, it had been dark, and there had been a seized engine to look at. I'm afraid that's not a very gallant remark. What I mean is that to anyone with a mechanical mind, a motor car in that condition is much more interesting than... well, it is very interesting, but why labour the point? However, in the sitting room, in the lamplight, it was possible to get more of an idea. She was a little older than I'd thought, and her eyes were too close together. Of course, she wasn't a... how shall I put it? Her manners weren't quite easy, and she was careful with her English. You know. But that wasn't it. She treated us with a lack of friendliness which was... well, we'd done nothing to deserve it. There was a sort of vague hostility and suspicion, which seemed rather hard lines, considering. Also, she was so anxious to keep in the shadow that if I hadn't moved the lamp away, she'd never have got near the fire at all. And the way she hurried the wretched Williams over his drink was quite distressing, and foolish too, as he was going to drive. But that was her funnel. When he'd gone out to start up his engine, I asked her if she was all right for money, and she apparently was. Then they started off, and I shut up the place and went upstairs. There happened to be a local guidebook in my bedroom, with maps in it. I looked at these, and couldn't help wondering where the girl in the car had come from. I mean, my road seemed so very unimportant. The sort of road one might use if one wanted to avoid people. If one were driving a stolen car, for instance. This was quite a thrilling idea. I thought it might be worthwhile having another look at the car. So I once more unhooked the key from the kitchen dresser and sallied forth into the snow. It was as black as pitch, and so still that my candle hardly flickered. It wasn't a large garage, and the car nearly filled it. By the by, we'd backed it in so as to make it easier to tow it out again. The engine I'd already seen, so I squeezed past along the wall and opened the door in the body part of the car. At least, I only turned the handle, and the door was pushed open from the inside, and something fell out on me. It pushed me quite hard, and wedged me against the wall. It also knocked the candle out of my hand, and left me in the dark, which was a bit of a nuisance. I wondered what on earth the thing was, barging into me like that, so I felt it rather gingerly, and found it was a man. A dead man, with a moustache. He'd evidently been sitting propped up against the door. I managed to put him back as decorously as possible, and shut the door again. After a lot of grovelling about under the car, I found the candle and lighted it, and opened the opposite door, and switched on the little lamp in the roof. And then... Of course, I had to make some sort of examination. He was an extremely tall and thin individual. He must have been well over 6'3". He was dark and very cadaverous-looking. In fact, I don't suppose he'd ever looked so cadaverous in his life. He was wearing a trench coat. It wasn't difficult to tell what he'd died of. He'd been shot through the back. I found the hole just under the right scrofula, or scalpel. What is shoulder blade, anyway? Oh, clavicle. Stupid of me. Well, that's where it was, and the bullet had evidently gone through into the lung. I say evidently, and leave it at that. There were no papers in his pockets, and no tailor's name on his clothes, but there was a note case with £9 in it. Altogether a most unpleasant business. Of course, it doesn't do to question the workings of Providence, but one couldn't help wishing it hadn't happened. It was just a little mysterious, too. Who had killed him? It wasn't likely that the girl had, or she wouldn't have been joy-riding about the country with him. And if someone else had murdered him, why hadn't she mentioned it? Anyway, she hadn't, and she'd gone, so one couldn't do anything for the time being. No telephone, of course. I just locked up the garage and went to bed. That was 2:00. Next morning I woke early, for some reason or other, and it occurred to me as a good idea to go and have a look at things by daylight, and before Mrs. Selston turned up. So I did. The first thing that struck me was that it had snowed heavily during the night, because there were no wheel tracks or footprints, and the second was that I'd left the key in the garage door. I opened it and went in. The place was completely empty. No car, no body, no nothing. There was a patch of grease on the floor where I dropped the candle. Otherwise, there was nothing to show I'd been there before. One of two things must have happened. Either some people had come along during the night and taken the car away, or else I'd fallen asleep in front of the fire and dreamt the whole thing. Then I remembered the whisky glasses. They should still be in the sitting-room. I went back to look, and they were, all three of them. So it hadn't been a dream, and the car had been fetched away. But they must have been jolly quiet over it. The girl had left her glass on the mantelpiece, and it showed several very clearly defined finger marks. Some were mine, naturally, because I'd fetched the glass from the kitchen and poured out the drink for her, but her finger marks, were clean, and mine were oily, so it was quite easy to tell them apart. It isn't necessary to point out that this glass was very important. There'd evidently been a murder, or something of that kind, and the girl must have known all about it, even if she hadn't actually done it herself, so anything she had left in the way of evidence ought to be handed over to the police. And this was all she had left. So I packed it up with meticulous care in an old biscuit box out of the larder. When Mrs. Selston came, I settled up with her and came back to town. Oh, I called on the landlord on the way and told him I'd let him know about the bungalow. Then I caught my train, and in due course drove straight to Scotland Yard. I went up and saw my friend there. I produced the glass, and asked him if his people could identify the marks. He said, probably not, but he sent it down to the fingerprint department, and asked me where it came from. I said, never you mind, let's have the identification first. He said, all right. They're awfully quick, these people. The clerk was back in 3 minutes with a file of papers. They knew the girl all right. They told me her name and showed me her photograph. Not flattering. Quite an adventurous lady, from all accounts. In the early part of her career, she'd done time twice for shoplifting, chiefly in the book department. Then she'd what they call taken up with a member of one of those race gangs one sometimes hears about. My pal went on to say that there'd been a fight between two of these gangs, in the course of which her friend had got shot. She'd managed to get him away in a car, but it had broken down somewhere in Norfolk, so she'd left it and the dead man in someone's garage, and had started off for Norwich in a lorry. Only she never got there. On the way, the lorry had skidded, and both she and the driver, a fellow called Williams, had been thrown out, and they'd rammed their heads against a brick wall, which everyone knows is a fatal thing to do. At least it was in their case. I said, look here, it's all very well, but you simply can't know all this. There hasn't been time. It only happened last night. He said, last night be blowed. It all happened in February 1919. The people you've described have been dead for years. I said, oh. And to think that I might have stuck to that £9. The hair. I'm going to give you an account of certain occurrences. I shan't attempt to explain them, because they're quite beyond me. When you've heard all the facts, some of you may be able to offer suggestions. You must forgive me for going into a certain amount of detail. When you don't understand what you're talking about, it's so difficult to know what to leave out. This business began in the Dark Ages, before there was any broadcasting. In fact, in 1921. I'd been staying the weekend with a friend of mine who lives about 15 miles out of Bristol. There was another man stopping there too, who lived at Dawlish. Well, on the Monday morning, our host drove us into Bristol in time for the Dawlish man to catch his train, which left a good deal earlier than the London one. Of course, if old Einstein had done his job properly, we could both have gone by the same train. As it was, I had over half an hour to wait. Talking of Einstein, wouldn't it be almost worthwhile dying young, so as to hear what Euclid says to him when they meet, wherever it is? There was a funny little old sort of curiosity shop in one of the streets I went down, and I stopped to look in the window. Right at the back, on a shelf, was a round brass box, not unlike a powder box in shape, and it rather took my fancy. I don't know why. Perhaps it was because I'd never seen anything quite like it before. That must be why some women buy some hats. Anyway, the shop window was so dirty that you could hardly see through it, so I went inside to have a closer look. An incredibly old man came out of the back regions and told me all he knew about the box, which wasn't very much. It was fairly heavy, made of brass, round, 4 inches high, and about 3 inches in diameter. There was something inside it, which we could hear when we shook it, but no one had ever been able to get the lid off. He'd bought it from a sailor some years before, but couldn't say in the least what part of the world it came from. "What about 15 bob?" I offered him 10, and he took it very quickly, and then I had to sprint back to the station to catch my train. When I got home, I took the box up into my workshop and had a proper look at it. It was extremely primitive as regards work, and had evidently been made by hand, and not on a lathe. Also, there had been something engraved on the lid, but it had been taken off with a file. Next job was to get the lid off without doing any damage to it. It was a good deal more than hand-tight, and no ordinary methods were any good. I stood it lid downwards for a week in a dish of glycerine as a start, and then made 2 brass collars, one for the box and one for the lid. At the end of the week, I bolted the collars on, fixed the box in the vise, and tried tapping the lid round with a hammer. But it wouldn't start. Then I tried it the other way, and it went at once. That explained why no one had ever been able to unscrew it. It had a left-handed thread on it. Rather a dirty trick, especially to go and do it all those years before. Well, here it was, unscrewing very sweetly, and I began to feel quite like Howard Carter, wondering what I was going to find. It might go off, bang, or jump out and hit me in the face. However, nothing exciting happened when the lid came off. In fact, the box only seemed to be half full of dust, but at the bottom was a curled-up plait of hair. When straightened out, it was about 9 inches long, and nearly as thick as a pencil. I unplaited a short length, and found it consisted of some hundreds of very fine hairs, but in such a filthy state, I shoved them under the microscope, that there was nothing much to be seen. So I thought I'd clean them. You may as well know the process. First of all, a bath of dilute hydrochloric acid to get the grease off. Then a solution of washing soda to remove the acid. Then a washing in distilled water. Then a bath of alcohol to get rid of any traces of water. And a final rinsing in ether to top off with. Just as I took it out of the ether, they called me down to the telephone, so I shoved it down on the first clean thing which came handy, namely a piece of white cardboard, and went downstairs. When I examined the plait later on, the only thing of interest that came to light was the fact that the hairs had all apparently belonged to several different women. The colours ranged from jet black through brown, red and gold, right up to pure white. None of the hair was dyed, which proved how very old it was. I showed it to one or two people, but they didn't seem very enthusiastic, so I put it, and its box, in a little corner cupboard we have, and forgot all about it. Then the first strange coincidence happened. About 10 days later, a pal of mine called Matthews came into the club with a bandage across his forehead. People naturally asked him what was the matter, and he said he didn't know, and what's more, the doctor didn't know. He'd suddenly flopped down on his drawing-room floor in the middle of tea and lain like a log. His wife was in a fearful stew, of course, and telephoned for the doctor. However, Matthews came round at the end of about 5 minutes and sat up and asked what had hit him. When the doctor blew in a few minutes later, he was pretty well all right again, except for a good deal of pain in his forehead. The doctor couldn't find anything the matter except a red mark, which was beginning to show on the skin just where the pain was. Well, this mark got clearer and clearer, until it looked just like a blow from a stick. Next day it was about the same, except that a big bruise had come up all round the mark. After that, it got gradually better. Matthews took the bandage off and showed it me at the club, and there was nothing much more than a bruise with a curved red line down the middle of it, like the track of a red-hot worm. They decided that he'd had an attack of giddiness, and must somehow have bumped his head in falling, and that was that. About a month later, my wife said to me, "We really must tidy your workshop." And I said, "Must we?" And she said, "Yes, it's a disgrace." So up we went. Tidying my workshop consists of putting the tools back in their racks, and of my wife wanting to throw away things she finds on the floor, and me saying, "Oh no, I could use that for so-and-so." The first thing we came across was the piece of white cardboard I'd used to put the plait of hair on while I'd run to the telephone that day. When we came to look at the other side, we found it was a flashlight photograph of a dinner I'd been at. You know what happens. Just before the speeches, a lot of blighters come in with a camera and some poles with tin trays on the top, and someone says, "Will the chairman please stand?" and he's helped to his feet. Then there's a blinding flash, and the room's full of smoke, and the blighters go out again. Later on, a man comes round with proofs, and if you are very weak, or near the chairman, you order one print. Well, this dinner had been the worshipful company of skate fasteners, or something, and I'd gone as the guest of the same bloke Matthews I've already been telling you about, and we'd sat side by each, as the saying is. My wife was looking at the photograph, and she said, "What's that mark on Mr. Matthews' forehead?" And I looked, and there, sure enough, was the exact mark that he'd come into the club with a month before. The curious part being, of course, that the photograph had been taken at least 6 months before he'd had the funny attack which caused the mark. Now then, on the back of the photograph, when we examined it, was a faint brown line. This was evidently left by the plait of hair when I pinned it out to dry, and it had soaked through and caused the mark on Matthew's face. I checked it by shoving a needle right through the cardboard. Of course, this looked like a very strange coincidence on the face of it. I don't know what your experience of coincidences is, but mine is that they usually aren't. Anyway, I took the trouble to trace out the times, and I finally established, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I had pinned the hair out on the photograph between 4 and 1/4 on a particular day, and that Matthews had had his funny attack on the same day at about 4:15. That was something like a coincidence. Next, the idea came to me to try it again. Not on poor old Matthews, obviously. He'd already had some, and besides, he was a friend of mine. I know perfectly well that we are told to be kind to our enemies, and so on. In fact, I do quite a lot of that. But when it comes to trying an experiment of this kind, even if the chances are 1,000,000 to 1 against it being a success, I mean having any result, One naturally chooses an enemy rather than a friend. I looked round for a suitable victim, someone who wouldn't be missed much in case there happened to be another coincidence. The individual on whom my choice fell was the nurse next door. We can see into their garden from our bathroom window, and we'd often noticed the rotten way she treated the child she had charge of when she thought no one was looking. Nothing one could definitely complain about. You know what a thankless job it is to butt into your neighbour's affairs. But she was systematically unkind, and we hated the sight of her. Oh, another thing, when she first came, she used to lean over the garden wall and sneak our roses. At least, she didn't even do that. She used to pull them off their stalks and let them drop. I soon stopped that. I fitted up some little arrangements of fish-hooks round some of the most accessible roses, and anchored them to the ground with wires. There was Helen Tommy the next morning, and she had her hand done up in bandages for a week. Altogether, she was just the person for my experiment. The first thing was to get a photograph of her, so the next sunny morning, when she was in the garden, I made a noise like an aeroplane out of the bathroom window to make her look up, and got her nicely. As soon as the first print was dry, about 11 o'clock the same night, I fastened the plait of hair across the forehead with 2 pins, feeling extremely foolish, as one would, of course, doing an idiotic thing like that, and put it away in a drawer in my workshop. The evening of the next day, when I got home, my wife met me and said, "What do you think? The nurse next door was found dead in bed this morning." And she went on to say that the people were quite upset about it, and there was going to be an inquest, and all the rest of it. Oh, I tell you, you could have knocked me down with a brick. I said, "No, not really. What did she die of?" You must understand that my lady wife didn't know anything about the experiment. She'd never have let me try it. She's rather superstitious, in spite of living with me. As soon as I could, I sneaked up to the workshop drawer and got out the photograph, and I know you won't believe me, but it doesn't make any difference. When I unpinned the plait of hair and took it off, there was a clearly marked brown stain right across the nurse's forehead. I tell you, that did make me sit up, if you like, because that made twice. First Matthews, and now... It was rather disturbing, and I know it sounds silly, but I couldn't help feeling to blame in some vague way. Well, the next thing was the inquest. I attended that, naturally, to know what the poor unfortunate woman had died of. Of course, they brought it in as death from natural causes, namely, several burst blood vessels in the brain. But what puzzled the doctors was what had caused the natural causes. Also, she had the same sort of mark on her forehead as Matthews had had. They had gone very thoroughly into the theory that she might have been exposed to X-rays. It did look a bit like that, but it was more or less proved that she couldn't have been, so they frankly gave it up. Of course, it was all very interesting and entertaining, and I quite enjoyed it, as far as one can enjoy an inquest, but they hadn't cleared up the vexed question. Did she fall, or was she well, had she snuffed it on account of the plait of hair, or had she not? Obviously the matter couldn't be allowed to rest there. It was much too thrilling. So I looked about for someone else to try it on, and decided that a man who lived in the house opposite would do beautifully. He wasn't as bad as the nurse, because he wasn't cruel. At least, not intentionally. He played the fiddle. So I decided not to kill him more than I could help. The photograph was rather a bother, because he didn't go out much. You've no idea how difficult it is to get a decent full-face photograph of a man who knows you by sight without him knowing. However, I managed to get one after a fortnight or so. It was rather small, and I had to enlarge it, but it wasn't bad, considering. He used to spend most of his evenings up in a top room, practising, double-stopping and what-not, so after dinner I went up to my workshop window, which overlooks his, and waited for him to begin. Then, when he'd really warmed up to his job, I just touched the plait across the photograph, not hard, but Well, like you do when you are testing a bit of twin flex, to find out which wire is which. You touch the ends across an accumulator or an HT battery. Quite indefensible in theory, but invariably done in practice. Personally, I always use the electric light mains. The required information is so instantly forthcoming. Well, that's how I touched the photograph with the plat. The first time I did it, my bloke played a wrong note. That was nothing, of course, so I did it again, more slowly. This time there was no doubt about it. He hastily put down his fiddle and hung out of the window, gasping like a fish for about 5 minutes. I tell you, I was so surprised that I felt like doing the same. However, I pulled myself together and wondered whether one ought to burn the plat or not. But there seemed too many possibilities in it for that, so I decided to learn how to use it instead. It would take too long to tell you all about my experiments. They lasted for several months, and I reduced the thing to such an exact science that I could do anything from giving a gnat a headache to killing a man. All this, mind you, at the cost of 1 man, 1 woman, lots of woodlice, and a conscientious objector. You must admit that that's pretty moderate, considering what fun one could have had with a discovery of that kind. Well, it seemed to me that now the control of my absent treatment had been brought to such a degree of accuracy, it would be rather a pity not to employ it in some practical way. In other words, to make a fortune quickly, without undue loss of life. One could, of course, work steadily through the people one disliked, but it wouldn't bring in anything for some time. I mean, even if you insure them first, you've got to wait a year before they die, or the company won't pay. And in any case, it begins to look fishy after you've done it a few times. Then I had my great idea. Why shouldn't my process be applied to horse racing? All one had to do was to pick some outsider in a race, back it for all you were worth at about 100 to 1, and then see that it didn't get beaten. The actual operation would be quite simple. One would only have to have a piece of cardboard with photographs of all the runners stuck on it, except the one that was to win, of course, and then take up a position giving a good view of the race. Well, I wasn't proposing to hurt any of the horses in the least. They were only going to get the lightest of touches, just enough to give them a tired feeling, soon after the start. Then, if my horse didn't seem to have the race well in hand near the finish, I could give one more light treatment to any horse which still looked dangerous. It stood to reason that great care would have to be taken not to upset the running too much. For instance, if all the horses except one fell down, or even stopped and began to graze, there would be a chance of the race being declared void. So I had 2 or 3 rehearsals. They worked perfectly. The last one hardly was a rehearsal, because I had a tenor on at 33 to 1, just for luck, and, of course, it came off. However, it wasn't as lucky as it sounds. Just outside the entrance to the grandstand, there was rather a squash, and, as I came away, I got surrounded by 4 or 5 men, who seemed to be pushing me about a bit, but it didn't strike me what the game was until one of them got his hand into the breast pocket of my coat. Then I naturally made a grab at him, and got him just above the elbow with both hands, and drove his hand still further into my pocket. That naturally pushed the pocket, with his hand inside it, under my right arm, and I squeezed it against my ribs for all I was worth. Now, there was nothing in that pocket but the test tube with the plait of hair in it, and the moment I started squeezing, it went with a crunch. I'm a bit hazy about the next minute, because my light-fingered friend tried to get free, and 2 of his pals helped him by bashing me over the head. They were quite rough. In fact, they entered so heartily into the spirit of the thing that they went on doing it until the police came up and collared them. You should have seen that hand when it did come out of my pocket, cut to pieces, and bits of broken glass sticking out all over it, like a crimson tipsy cake. He was so bad that we made a call at a doctor's on the way to the police station for him to have a small artery tied up. There was a cut on the back of my head that wanted a bit of attention too. Quite a nice chap, the doctor, but he was my undoing. He was, without doubt, the baldest doctor I've ever seen, though I once saw a balder alderman. When he'd painted me with iodine, I retrieved the rest of the broken glass and the hair from the bottom of my pocket, and asked him if he could give me an empty bottle to put it in. He said, "Certainly," and produced one, and we corked the hair up in it. When I got home, eventually, I looked in the bottle, but apart from a little muddy substance at the bottom, it was empty. The plait of hair had melted away. Then I looked at the label on the bottle, and found the name of a much-advertised hair restorer. My adventure at Chislehurst. Towards the end of last September, I went to the Radio A exhibition at Olympia, and very fine it was too. I drifted about, and after I'd, so to speak, done the ground floor, and was going up the stairs to the gallery, I ran into a man I knew. Just at the moment, it wouldn't do at all for me to mention his name, so I'll merely call him James. But there's no harm in saying that he was a retired stockbroker, and he lived near Chislehurst. Anyhow, there he was, and he hailed me with glee, and insisted on our walking round together. I was rather sorry about this, because it's so much more fun wandering about exhibitions by oneself, and not only that, he was evidently starting a bad cold, which didn't attract me particularly, but there was no getting out of it without offending him, so I didn't try. After all, he was by way of being a friend of mine, and I'd known him for ages, but we hadn't come across each other for some months, and during this time he'd gone and got married again, unexpected-like. I mean, everyone had come to look on him as a chronic widower, and he'd have probably stopped so if the daughter who kept house for him hadn't got married herself and gone to live in Birmingham. You must excuse these details, but I want you to understand exactly what the position was. As things were, he hadn't seen the catch of running an enormous great house all by himself, so Mrs. James II had come to the throne as a matter of course. I had never actually met her, but from all accounts she was a great success. James was so keen on telling me about how happy he was, and so on, that it was quite a job to make him take any interest in the show. But whenever he did deign to look at or listen to anything, he merely said it wasn't a patch on some rotten superhet he'd brought back from the United States. They'd spent their honeymoon there, for some unknown reason. I naturally wasn't going to stand this sort of thing for long, so I upped and made a few remarks about American superhets, which were very well received by adjacent stallholders. The remarks themselves weren't perhaps of general interest, but they landed me with a challenge. This was to dine with him that evening, hear his set, and, incidentally, meet his new wife. I hadn't got an excuse ready, so I said that I should be charmed to meet his wife, and, incidentally, hear his new set. It so happened that my car was in dock for 2 days, and James said he'd call for me at home and run me down. The question then arose as to whether I should dress first or take a bag down with me. Well, that doesn't sound important, I know, but it had a good deal to do with something that happened afterwards. As a matter of fact, I decided to change at home. I left James at the exhibition during the afternoon. He duly picked me up at my place at 6:30, or thereabouts, and we got down to Chislehurst just before 7. We were met by the news that Mrs. James wasn't in. She'd apparently taken out her own car during the morning, and gone off to see her mother, who lived at Worthing, and was a bit of an invalid. As this was a thing she'd been in the habit of doing every 2 or 3 weeks, it was nothing out of the way, but she usually got back earlier. At all events, pending her return, we went through the hall into the lounge, where people generally sat, and James began mixing cocktails. While he was doing this, I had a look round to see how much had been altered under the new management, as one would. The only unfamiliar object in the room seemed to be a large picture hanging over the mantelpiece. I was just strolling across to get a better view. It was getting a bit dark by this time, when James said, "Half a sec," and he switched on some specially arranged lights round the frame, which showed it up properly. Then he said, "What do you think of my wife?" Well, I looked at it and said, "Gosh, if that's at all like her, she must be one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen." And that's saying a lot. The portrait was by quite a well-known man, and he'd painted her exactly full face, and looking straight at you. You don't often see that, because so few people can stand it. The general effect was so realistic that one almost felt one was being introduced, and ought to say something. She was fair rather than dark, a little bit Scandinavian in appearance, and I put her down as a shade over 30. James finished mixing the cocktails and gave me mine, and then he took his up with him to dress, leaving me sitting in an armchair facing the fireplace and the picture. He couldn't have got further than the top of the stairs when the telephone bell in the hall rang, and he came running down to answer it. It was evidently his wife at the other end, and judging from what he said, she was explaining that she was stuck at Worthing for the night, owing to some trouble with the car. Nothing serious. He told me afterwards that she'd first of all had a bad puncture, and then found that the inner tube of the spare wheel was perished. The delay would have meant her driving part of the way home in the dark, which she didn't like. After that, the question of his cold cropped up. She must have asked after it, because I heard him say it wasn't any better. They talked about it for a bit, and then lapsed into the sloppy type of conversation, which one sort of expects between newly married people, but which is, nonetheless, averagely dull for anyone else to listen to. It may have been more than averagely dull in this case, because it almost sent me off to sleep. It didn't quite, but I got as far as the moment when the subconscious side of the brain begins to take control, and you sometimes get entirely fantastic ideas. Either that, or you try to hoof the end of the bed off. Anyhow, if you remember, I was sitting looking at this brightly illuminated picture of Mrs. James. Well, for an incredibly short space of time, I mean, you've no idea how short, the whole character of it seemed to change. Instead of an oil painting, in rather vivid colours, it suddenly looked like a photograph, or, to be strictly accurate, a photograph as reproduced in a newspaper. Try looking at one through a magnifying glass, not now, sometime, and imagine it to be 4 feet by 3, and you will get the same effect that I did. There was a name printed under this photograph, and my eyes certainly read it, but before my mind could take in what it was, the illusion was gone, and I was wide awake again. It was all over so quickly that I just said, "Oh, that's funny," and didn't pay much attention to it. When James came in, after a lengthy and idiotic goodbye on the telephone, I didn't even tell him. He'd have only made some fatuous joke about the strength of his cocktails. He was full of apologies about his wife not being able to get home, and so forth, and he explained what had happened with yards of detail. I'd gathered most of it already, but I had to pretend to listen with interest, so as to make him think I hadn't heard some of the other things that had been said. He then went up finally to dress, and again left me alone with the picture. But although I tried from every angle, both with and without the lights, I couldn't manage to recapture the peculiar half-tone effect. Neither was I able to remember the name which had appeared underneath. By the way, it is worth noting that if I'd decided to dress at Chislehurst instead of at home, I probably shouldn't have been left alone with the picture at all, and got the jim-jams about it. James came down in due course, and we had a most elaborate dinner. He always did things very well, and there was no reason why he shouldn't. People with 5,000 a year often do. At the end of dinner, we carted our coffee and old brandy into the lounge, and then he introduced me to his unspeakable wireless set. I hadn't spotted it earlier, because it was housed in a tall boy, which had always been there, Needless to say, the tall boy was far and away the best thing about it. When he switched it on, the volume of distorted noise was so appalling that I can't think why the ceiling didn't come down. There was a long and terrible period, during which we could only converse by means of signs, and then, to my great relief, one of his transformers caught fire, and we had to put it out with a soda-water siphon. By then it was getting on for 11, and I said it was time to go. That, of course, meant a final whisky, and he was just starting on his, which he'd mixed with milk, by the way, when he put it down and said, "My word, I shall hear about it if I don't take my aspirin," and he went upstairs to fetch some. He was gone 3 or 4 minutes, and when he came down he said he'd had the devil's own hunt, as he couldn't find any of his own, and had been obliged to beg his wife's last 3. These he proceeded to take, and then I really had to go, as there was only just time to catch my train, and that was that. Next morning, during breakfast, there was a ring at the bell, and they came and told me that Inspector Soames of Chislehurst wanted to see me, so I went out and interviewed him. He seemed quite a decent fellow, and he led off by inquiring how I was. I thanked him and said I was very well indeed. He next wanted to know if I'd slept well, and I told him that I had. But even then he wasn't happy. Was I sure I'd felt no discomfort of any kind during the night? I said, "None whatever, but why this sudden solicitude about my health?" He then said, "Well, you see, sir, it's like this. Last night you dined with Mr. James, in fact. You left him round about 11 p.m., and he presumably went straight to bed. However, at 3 o'clock this morning, groans were heard coming from his room, and when the servants went in, they found him lying half in and half out of bed, writhing with pain and partially unconscious. Doctors were immediately called in, and they did all they could, but by 6 o'clock he was dead." Well, this was naturally a great shock to me. It always is when you hear of people whom you know going out suddenly like that, especially when you've seen them alive and well such a little time before. I asked the inspector what James had died of, and he said, "Oh, probably some acute form of food poisoning. But it wouldn't be known for certain until after the post-mortem. In the meantime, would I mind telling him everything we had had to eat and drink the night before?" Which I did. Actually, it was only a check, because he'd already got it all down in his notebook. I dare say he'd been talking to the cook and the maids who'd waited on us. He even knew that I hadn't had any fish, whereas James had. But there was nothing wrong with that, as it had all been finished downstairs. I was able to be more helpful in the matter of drinks afterwards, and I didn't forget to mention the final whisky and milk and the 3 aspirins, all of which he carefully wrote down. I next inquired after Mrs. James. It had apparently been rather distressing about her. They'd telephoned to Worthing as soon as they found how gravely ill James was, and she'd arrived home just as he was dying. No one had had the nous to be on the lookout for her at the front door, and she'd got right up into the room and seen how things were before they could stop her. She had then completely collapsed, which was only natural, and they'd had to carry her to her room and put her to bed. Things were so bad with her that there was talk of a nurse being sent for. My inspector friend then went away, but he warned me that I should have to appear at the inquest, which would probably be 3 days later. I duly turned up, but wasn't called. They only took evidence of identification, and the proceedings were adjourned for 3 weeks to await the result of the post-mortem. I wrote to Mrs. James soon afterwards, asking if there was anything I could do, but she sent back a rather vague note about being too ill to see anyone, so we didn't meet. I had another interview with the police after that, but they didn't ask me any more questions about food, and when the adjourned inquest came on, it was perfectly obvious why. The cause of James's death wasn't food poisoning at all. It was 50 grains of perchloride of mercury. In case you don't know, perchloride of mercury is also called corrosive sublimate. It's used in surgical dressings, and 50 grains taken internally is a pretty hopeless proposition. In fact, according to what the very eminent pathologist person said in the witness box, it must be about as good for your tummy as molten lead. This great man went on to give it as his opinion that the poison must have been administered not more than 8 hours before death had taken place. This was allowing for the milk, which would have a retarding influence. As James had died at 6 in the morning, it meant that he must have taken his dose sometime after 10 o'clock the previous night. As I had been the last person to see him alive, or at any rate conscious, it made my evidence rather important, especially as it covered the first hour of the material 8. When my turn came, I told the court almost word for word what I'd told the inspector, right down to the 3 aspirins. The coroner asked me a whole lot of questions about James's manner and health, and I could only say that he had seemed normal, cheerful, and, bar his cold, healthy. When they'd done with me, Mrs. James was called, and I was able to see her properly for the first time. She was even better looking than her portrait, and black suited her. One could tell that she had the sympathy of everyone. She would. She was popular in the district, and the court was packed with her friends. The coroner treated her with the utmost consideration. She said that her relations with her husband had always been of the very best, and there had never been the ghost of a disagreement. She also stated that as far as she knew he had no worries, either financial or otherwise, and that he could have had no possible reason for taking his life. After that, the coroner became even more considerate than ever. One could see what he was after. He clearly had the fact in mind that when a rich man dies in mysterious circumstances, there are always plenty of people who seem to think that his widow ought to be hanged on spec. So, although their evidence was hardly, what shall I say, germane to the inquiry, witnesses were called who proved, in effect, that she had been at Worthing from lunchtime on the one day, right up to 4 in the morning on the next, and there was no getting away from it. Even the mechanic from the Worthing garage was roped in his Sunday clothes. He described the trouble with her tyres, and the discussion as to whether she could or could not have got home to Chislehurst before dark. There was a good deal more evidence of the same kind, and it all went to establish that whatever else had happened, Mrs. James couldn't possibly have murdered her husband, and as it seemed unlikely that he had committed suicide, the jury returned an open verdict. Now, what was I to do? On the face of it, and knowing what I did, it was my duty to get up and say something like this. "You'll pardon me, but that woman did murder her husband, and if you like, I'll tell you roughly how. She waits till he has a cold coming on, and then decides to pay one of her periodical visits to her mother at Worthing. She arranges to get hung up there for the night, but she telephones at dinner-time, and, I suggest, makes him promise to take some aspirin and whisky before he goes to bed, a perfectly normal remedy. She naturally takes jolly good care before starting in the morning that there are only 3 tablets of aspirin that he can get at, and these are the ones. The bottle they have been in is certainly a danger if the police get hold of it, but they don't get hold of it, because she arrives home in plenty of time to change it for another. If things had gone entirely right for her, and I hadn't happened to be dining there that evening, no one would have known about James's dose of aspirin at all, but her technique is so sound that I'm able to watch him take it and talk about it afterwards without it mattering. I don't suppose she liked it, but it didn't do her any appreciable harm. Then again, even if he forgets to take his tablets, she runs no risk. She merely has to wait till he gets another cold. In fact, the whole thing is cast iron. Now, supposing, for the sake of argument, that I'd got up and been allowed to say all this, what would have happened? I should have had to admit, straight off, that I couldn't produce a scrap of evidence to support any of it, at least not the kind of evidence that would wash with a jury. There certainly was James's remark, "I shall hear about it if I don't take my aspirin." That satisfied me, who he expected to hear about it from, but there was only my bare word for it that he'd put it that way, and you know what lawyers are. They mightn't have believed me. Then again, the coroner was a doctor. He would have asked me how it was possible to fake up perchloride of mercury to look like aspirin, and I should have had to agree that it wouldn't be at all easy. It happens to be a poison which the general public practically can't get, and even if they could, the tablets in which it is sold are carefully dyed blue. Besides which, they aren't the right shape. If you walked into a chemist's and asked him to bleach some of them white and make them look like aspirin, he might easily think it fishy, and I doubt whether you would set his mind at rest by saying that you only wanted them for a joke or private theatricals. All of this I knew quite well, having taken the trouble to inquire. But there was another fact, which I didn't get to know till afterwards, which might have made a difference. It was rather strange. For a certain time during the war, the French army medical people had put up their perchloride of mercury in white tablets, not blue, and these did, in fact, closely resemble the present-day aspirin. Moreover, each tablet contained 17 grains. Now, 3 17s are 51, or almost exactly what James was reckoned to have taken. But all this would have gone for precisely nothing, even if I'd known it and said it, unless any of these convenient tablets could be traced to Mrs. James, and they most definitely couldn't. The police had searched the house as a matter of routine, and analysed every bottle, whether empty or full. One might also safely conclude that they had made inquiries at all the chemists where the lady might have dealt. I know they went to mine. Then there was another thing which made it difficult to accuse Mrs. James, and that was the absence of motive, because the obvious one, money, was practically ruled out. It transpired that she had 1,200 a year of her own, and the average woman with as much as that isn't likely to marry and then murder some wretched man for the sake of another 5,000. She wouldn't take the trouble. In fact, what with one thing and another, my theory didn't stand a hope, so I thought I'd let it stew a little longer. The lady left the court without a stain on her character, and later on went to live in the Isle of Wight. For all I know, she is still there, enjoying her 1,200 plus 5,000 a year. But whether she will go on doing it is quite another thing. Because, a short time ago, I was just finishing a pipe before going to bed, when suddenly, apropos of nothing, there came into my head the name I had seen under her picture at the instant it had looked like a photograph. It was a somewhat peculiar name, and not the one under which she had married James. All the same, one doesn't imagine a name for no reason at all, so I worked it out that at some time or other I must have actually seen a published photograph of Mrs. James, and that staring at the picture down at Chislehurst had brought it back to me. Anyhow, the following day I got my literary agent to send round to all the newspaper offices in Fleet Street and inquire whether a photograph of anyone of this name had appeared during the last few years. They all said no. However, my agent is of a persevering nature. He has to be. He went on and tackled the illustrated weekly papers, and he struck oil almost at once. About 8 years ago, one of them had apparently brought out what it called a Riviera supplement, and in it was the photograph. I went along and recognised it immediately, but what interested me most of all was the paragraph that referred to it. It said that this Miss What's-her-name had been acting as companion to an old lady who had a villa at Cannes. One day she, the companion, had gone across into Italy to see her mother, who lived at Bordighera and was a bit of an invalid. For some reason or other, she missed the last train back and had to spend the night at Bordighera. But when she did arrive back at Cannes next day, she was shocked to find that her employer had poisoned herself during the night. The paper didn't say what poison the old lady took, or how much money she left her companion. But I've found out since, and I'll give you 2 guesses. The Diver. For some reason or other, the BBC are always asking me to tell a ghost story. At least, they don't ask me, they tell me I've got to. I say, "What kind of a ghost story?" And they say, "Any kind you like, so long as it's a personal experience, and perfectly true." Just like that. And it's cramped my style a bit. Oh, not that my personal experiences aren't true, please don't think that. But it's simply this, that when it comes to supernatural matters, my luck hasn't been very good. It isn't that I don't believe in such things on principle, but I do like to be present when the manifestations actually occur, instead of just taking other people's word for them. And, somehow or other, as I've said before, my luck has not been very good. Lots of people have tried to convert me. There was one young woman in particular. She took a lot of trouble about it. Quite a lot. She used to take me to all sorts of parties where they had séances. You know the kind, table-turning, planchette, and so on. But it wasn't any good. Nothing ever happened when I was there. Nothing spiritual, that is. People always said, "Ah, my boy, you ought to have been here last night. The table fairly got up and hit us in the face." Possibly very wonderful. But, after all, the ground will do that, if you let it. Well, as I say, they took me to several of these parties, and we used to sit for hours, round tables, in a dim light, holding hands. Well, that was rather fun, sometimes. It depended on who one sat next to. But apart from that, the nights they took me, no manifestations ever occurred. Planchette wouldn't spell a word, and the table might have been screwed to the floor. To begin with, they used to put it down to chance, or the conditions not being favourable. But after a time, they began to put it down to me. And I thought, something will have to be done about it. It's never amusing to be looked upon as a sort of Jonah. So I invented a patent table tapper. It was made on the same principle as lazy tongs. You held it between your knees, and when you squeezed it, a little mallet shot up. It was really a cotton reel stuck on the end of a pencil, and it hit the underneath of the table a proper biff. It was worked entirely with the knees, so that I could still hold the hands of the people on either side of me, and it was a success from the word go. At the very next séance, as soon as the lights were down, I gave just a gentle tap. Our host said, "Ah, a powerful force is present," and I gave a louder ponk. Then he said, "How do you say yes?" And I said, "Ponk." Then he said, "How do you say no?" And I said, "Ponk, ponk." So far, so good. Communication established. Then people began asking questions, and I spelt out the answers. Awful hard work, ponking right through the alphabet, but quite worth it. I'm afraid some of my answers made people sit up a bit. They got quite nervous as to what was coming next. Needless to say, this was some years ago. Then someone said, "Who's going to win the derby?" I don't know who said that, and I laboriously spelt out Signorinetta. This was 2 days before the race. I don't know why I said Signorinetta, because there were several horses with shorter names, but it just came into my head. The annoying thing was that I didn't take my own tip and back it. You may remember it won at 100 to 1 by I don't know how many lengths, 5 lengths dividing second and third. However, it's no use crying over the stable door after the horse has spilt the milk, and it has nothing whatever to do with the story. The amusing thing was that when the séance was over, various people came round to me and said, "Now will you believe in spiritualism? What more proof do you want?" And so on and so forth. It struck me as rather rich that they should try to convert me with my own false evidence, and I don't mind betting you that if I'd owned up to the whole thing being a spoof, not a soul would have believed me. That's always the way. Well, I've told you all this to show you that I'm not exactly dippy on the subject of spiritualism. At any rate, not the table-turning variety. Very largely because it is so easy to fake your results. But when something genuinely uncanny comes along, why, then I'm one of the very first to be duly thrilled and mystified and, what-not. It's one of those genuine cases I want to tell you about. It happened to me personally. But first of all, you must know that there's a swimming bath at my club. Very good swimming bath, too. Deep at one end and shallow at the other. There's a sort of hall place adjoining it, and in this hall there's a sandwich bar, very popular. It's much cheaper than lunching upstairs. Quite a lot of people seem to gravitate down there, especially towards the end of the month. Everything's quite informal. You just go to the counter and snatch what you want and take it to a table and eat it. Then when you've done, you go and tell George what you've had. George runs the show, and he says 1 and 9pence, or whatever it is, and that's that. Personally, I usually go to a table in a little recess close to the edge of the swimming bath itself. You have to go down a few steps to get to it, but you are rather out of the turmoil, and not so likely to get anything spilt over you. It's quite dangerous sometimes, people darting in and out like a lot of sharks. Which reminds me, a member once wrote in to the secretary, complaining that the place wasn't safe. I shan't say who it was, but you'd know his name if I told you. I managed to get hold of a copy of his letter. This is what he says, speaking of the sandwich bar. I once saw an enormous shark, at least 5 feet 10 inches long, go up to the counter and seize a sausage roll, itself nearly 4 inches long, and take it away to devour it. When he had bitten off the end, which he did with a single snap of his powerful jaws, he found that it was empty. The sausage, which ought to have been inside, had completely vanished. It had been stolen by another shark, even more voracious and ferocious than himself. Never shall I forget the awful spectacle of the baffled and impotent rage of this fearful monster. He went back to the counter, taking the empty sarcophagus with him, and said, "George, I have been stung." In order to avoid such scenes of unparalleled and revolting cruelty— Well, after that, he is rather inclined to exaggerate, so I shan't read any more. I usually go late when the rush is over, and it's fairly quiet. People come and practice diving, and sometimes they are worth watching, and sometimes not. That's the sort of place it is, and if you know of anywhere less likely to be haunted, I should like to see it. Very well, then. One day I was just finishing lunch when there was a splash. I was reading a letter and didn't look up at once, but when I did, I was rather surprised to see no ripples on the water, and no one swimming about. So I went on with my letter, and didn't think any more about it. That was all that happened that day. 2 or 3 weeks later, at about the same time, I was again finishing lunch, and there was another splash. This time I looked up almost at once, and saw the ripples, and it struck me then that it must have been an extraordinarily clean dive, considering that whoever it was must have gone in off the top. One could tell that from where the ripples were, well out into the middle. So I waited for him to come up. But he didn't come up. Then I thought that he must be doing a length under water, and I got up and went to the edge of the bath to watch for him. But still he didn't come up, and I got a bit worried. He might have bumped his head on the bottom, or fainted, or anything, and I saw myself having to go in after him with all my clothes on. I sprinted right round the bath, but there was undoubtedly no one in it. The attendant came out of one of the dressing rooms, and evidently thought I'd gone cracked. So I went to the weighing machine and weighed myself, 11 stone 8, but I don't think he believed me. That was the second incident. The third came about a fortnight later. This time I saw the whole thing quite clearly. I was sitting at my usual table, and I saw a man climbing up the ladder leading to the top diving board. When he got up there, he came out to the extreme end of the plank, and stood for a few seconds, rubbing his chest and so on, like people often do. He was rather tall and muscular, dark, with a small moustache, but what particularly caught my eye was a great big scar he had. It was about 9 inches long, and it reached down from his left shoulder towards the middle of his chest. It looked like a bad gash with a bayonet. It must have hurt quite a lot when it was done. I don't know why I took so much notice of him, but I just did, that's all. And, funnily enough, he seemed to be just as much interested in me as I was in him. He gave me a most meaning look. I don't know what it meant, but it was undoubtedly a meaning look. As soon as he saw that he'd got me watching him, he dived in, and it was the most gorgeous dive I've ever seen. Hardly any noise or splash, just a gentle sort of plop, as though he'd gone into oil rather than water, and the ripples died away almost at once. I thought, if only he'll do that a few more times, it'll teach me a lot. And I waited for him to come up, and waited, but not a sign. I went to the edge of the bath, and then I walked right round it. But, bar the water, it was perfectly empty. However, to make absolutely certain, I mean that he couldn't have got out without my seeing him, I dug out the attendant and satisfied myself that no towels and costumes had been given out since 12 o'clock. It was then 2:30, and he, the attendant, he'd actually seen the last man leave. The thing was getting quite serious. My scarred friend couldn't have melted away in the water, nor could he have dived slap through the bottom of the bath, at least not without leaving some sort of mark. So it was obvious that either the man had been a ghost, which was absurd. Who's ever heard of a ghost in a swimming bath? I mean, the idea's too utterly wet for anything. Or that there was something wrong with the light lager I was having for lunch. I went back to my table and found I'd hardly begun it. And in any case, let me tell you, it was such light lager that a gallon of it wouldn't have hurt a child of 6. And, well, I'm not a child of 6. So I ruled that out, and decided to wait and see if it happened again. It wouldn't have done to say anything about it. One's friends are apt to be a bit flippant when you tell them things like that. However, I made a point of sitting at the same table for weeks and weeks afterwards, but old Stick-in-the-Mud didn't show up again. A good long time after this, it must have been 18 months or more, I got an invitation to dine with some people called Pringle. They were old friends of mine, but I hadn't seen them for a long time, because they'd mostly lived in Mexico, and one rather loses touch with people at that distance. Anyway, they were going back there in a few days, and this was a sort of farewell dinner. They'd given up their flat and were staying at an hotel. They'd got another man dining with them. His name was Mellowish, and he was, with one exception, the most offensive blighter I've ever come across. Do you know those people who open their mouths to contradict what you are going to say before you've even begun to say it? Well, he did that, among other things. It was rather difficult to be entirely civil to him. He was travelling back to Mexico with the Pringles, as he'd got the job of manager to one of their properties. Something to do with oil, but I didn't quite grasp what. My mind was so taken up with trying to remember where on earth I'd seen the man before. Of course, you all know. You know he was the man who dived into the swimming bath. It sticks out about a mile, naturally, but I'd only seen him once before, in a bad light, and it took me till halfway through the fish to place him. Then it came back with a rush, and my interest in him became very lively. He was an American, and he'd come over to England 2 months before, looking for a job. So he said. I asked him why he'd left America, but he didn't hear. But it did seem fairly certain that he'd never been in Europe before. So, when we got to dessert, I proceeded to drop my brick. I said, "Do you mind telling me whether you have a scar on your chest like this?" And I described it. The Pringles just stared, but Mellowish looked as if he were going to have a fit. Then he pulled himself together and said, "Have you ever been in America?" And I said, "No, not that I know of." Then he said, "Well, it's a most extraordinary thing, but I have a scar on my chest." And he went on to explain how he'd got it. Funnily enough, he'd gone in for high diving a lot when he was younger, and taken any amount of prizes. and on one occasion he'd found a sharp stake at the bottom of a river. He gave us full particulars, very messy. But what they all wanted to know was how I knew anything about it. Of course, it was a great temptation to tell 'em, but they'd only have thought I'd gone off my rocker. So I started a hare about perhaps having seen a photograph of his swimming club in some newspaper or other. They caught on to that idea quite well, so I left them to it. The whole thing was by way of being rather a problem, and it kept me awake that night. Without being up in such matters, it did occur to me that it might be a warning of some kind. Is it likely that anyone, even a ghost, would take the trouble to come all the way from America simply to show me how well he could dive? Of course not. And I sort of thought that a man who was in the habit of going in off the deep end and not coming up again was no fit travelling companion for any friends of mine. Now, I'm not superstitious, goodness knows. Of course, I don't walk under ladders, or light 3 matches with 1 cigarette, or any of those things, but that's because they're unlucky, not because I'm superstitious. Anyhow, in case the Pringles might be, I went round next day and saw them. At least, I saw her, he was out, and told her all about the apparition at the club, and so on. Well, that did it. She fairly went off pop. It was a portent, a direct intervention of Providence. Nothing would induce her to travel with Mellowish after what she'd heard, and all the rest of it. I left her to carry on the good work. I don't know how she managed it, but the fact remains that the Pringles did not start for Mexico as arranged, and Mellowish did. And now you are expecting me to say that the ship in which he sailed was never heard of again. But that wouldn't be strictly true. He got to the other side all right, but the train in which he was travelling through Mexico had to cross a bridge over a river. A steel bridge it was. Now, some months previously there'd been a slight scrap between 2 local bands of brigands, in the course of which the bridge had been blown up. When the quarrel was patched up, the bridge was patched up too, but not with the meticulous care it might have been. The result was that in the daytime, when the sun was hot and the steelwork fully expanded, it was a perfectly good bridge, but at night, when it was cold and the girders had shrunk a bit, well, it didn't always quite meet in the middle. It so happened that the train in question tried to cross this wretched bridge at the very moment when it was having rather a job to make both ends meet, and it simply couldn't bear it. The middle span carried away, and the engine and 2 carriages crashed through into the river, and 14 people were killed. It was very sad, about 13 of them, but the 14th was Mr. Mellowish. There must be a moral to this story, if I could only think of it, but I can't. So perhaps some of you can help me by suggesting one. My adventure on Dartmoor. Good evening, everyone. I always seem to bring my troubles here. I'm going to grouse tonight about a piece of ingratitude that someone's treated me to, and it may make me feel a little less bitter to get it off my chest. Last November, I was spending a few days in Devonshire with 2 very good friends of mine, a Mr. and Mrs. Harris. Charming people they are. I'm sure you'd like them. He writes books, and she illustrates them. Or else it's the other way round. Anyway, there the matter seems to end. That is, I've never heard of anything of theirs getting published. But it doesn't matter, as they've got enough to live on without that. They've a little cottage on Dartmoor, and they live in it all the year round. Quite a nice cottage, whitewashed. There's a little wooden porch in front, and a sort of barn place at one end. They keep a cow and car, which both live in the barn. The cow's called Constance, and the car's a runabout. You know the kind. They run about a mile, and then, owing to a slight technical hitch, they stop. Of course, they have to have something to get about in, because they are 3 miles from a village, and 12 from a station. I tell you, it's pretty wild there. The last half-mile of road leading to their place is little more than a sheep track. If you want a cocktail on Sunday morning, you have to walk 3 miles across the moor to the nearest inn, and when you get there, you have to show the man how to mix it. He hasn't got half the things, and it tastes like death. And then you walk all the way home again. Oh, it's great fun. Well, I think I've said enough to show you the sort of place it is. Well, the day after I got there, Mrs. Harris went and broke a back tooth on a brandy ball, and as it was very uncomfortable and making a sore place on her tongue, he had to drive her into Exeter to the dentist to have it mended. They started about 1:30, and if all went well, they hoped to be back by tea-time. However, in case anything unforeseen should happen to prevent them getting back that night, they told me how a young youth would blow along to milk Constance at about 4, and that a species of char-lady might or might not turn up next morning to light fires. If she didn't, I should have to do it myself. I was carefully instructed about shutting up the chickens, what the dog and cat were to have to eat, and when and where they slept. In fact, all about it. The car then lurched off down the track, and quite soon I was the only person for miles. Time had to be filled up somehow, so Jock and I did a bit of ratting in the garage. Jock's a wire-haired fox terrier, I may tell you. This took till getting on for 4, and then it got so cold and windy that we chucked it and went indoors. The youth turned up and milked Constance and shut her up for the night. He also informed me that it was going to rain. He was quite right. He hadn't been gone 10 minutes before it began to come down in sheets. So I shut up the chickens before their time and piled coal onto the fires in the sitting-room and kitchen, lighted the lamp, and then I drew up an armchair, with the dog on one side and the cat on the other, and went to sleep, fully intending to have the kettle boiling and all the rest of it by the time the Harrises got back. Well, it may have been the strong air, but whatever it was, I didn't wake up till 7:10, and no sign of the Harrises. I had a look at the weather, and it seemed quite on the cards that there wouldn't be any Harrises that night. It was raining harder than ever. Beastly stuff it was, half rain and half sleet, and blowing a gale as well. They'd probably run for shelter somewhere. In the meantime, I was on my own, and very hungry. Next move, obviously dinner. So I scavenged, no, that's not the word, foraged in the larder, and began very well with cold beef and cold beer. Rather chilly for such a cold night, so a hot second course seemed indicated. What about Welsh rabbit? I chopped up some cheese and butter into the frying pan, poured some beer over it, and I think a little milk, and put it on the fire. Well, whether it wasn't the right kind of cheese, or the quantities were wrong, I don't know, but when I tried to pour the result onto a piece of toast, it wouldn't pour. In fact, it wasn't a fluid at all. It was more like a slab of crepe rubber. I managed to detach it from the frying pan with a hot knife, and tried wrapping it round the toast, but it kept springing undone. So Jock had it. It bothered him a bit too. Next I thought of sardines on toast being already available, so to speak. So I put 3 on it and held it over the fire. 1 rolled off, and then there were 2. The survivors were eatable, just. When I finished dinner, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and I settled down once more in front of the fire with the dog and cat, as before. There was really nothing else to do, and again, I ought to blush to say, fell asleep. At 9:30, a funny sort of tapping noise woke me up, a most peculiar noise. It sounded as if someone was prodding at the door and scraping it with a stick. I didn't take much notice at first. You know what it is when you're half asleep. I put it down to a bit of woodwork in the porch having broken loose and being blown about by the gale. But Jock started making a fuss, and sniffing under the door, so there evidently was someone. I got up and called out, "Who's there?" The door was bolted, because it had kept on blowing open. There was no answer, but I thought I could hear a sort of panting noise. Then it dawned on me. Of course, an escaped convict. We were only a few miles from Princetown, and the Harrises had gone off without telling me what they usually did in such cases. Ought I to offer him a bed and breakfast, or what? Anyway, I got bored with shouting, "Who's there?" and getting no answer, so I drew the bolt. In came the door with a gust of wind, and there, filling up the porch, was an enormous great beast with 2 staring eyes and a pair of horns. And I said, "So help me!" And before I realized that it was only Constance, she'd barged right in. There she stood in the middle of the floor, dripping wet, of course, and looking very sheepish, at least as sheepish as a cow can look, me wondering how she'd got out, and how she was to be got back again. Mind you, I think cows are perfectly ripping beasts, and I'm devoted to them, but they are a nuisance in a small room. I went up to her and said, "Now then, Connie, my girl, out you go." And she just stared. So I put an arm round her neck and urged her doorwards, but she wouldn't budge. Then I took her by the horns and tried to wheel her like a bicycle, but that was another bad guess, because she backed. She backed right across the room and sat down on Mrs. Harris's work-basket. Well, whether she found a needle or what, I don't know, but she said, "Moo!" and got up instantly. Then I got hold of her tail with my left hand and went forward with it, and tried pulling her along that way, with my right hand on her handlebars, so to speak. But that wouldn't work either, and I daren't pull too hard, in case the tail came right out. She went sideways, all right. In fact, we went round and round the room sideways for about 5 minutes, but no luck. We nearly got out once, but just at the cruciological moment she went and shoved a horn through a tall canvas screen there was, and brought it down on the top of us. End of round 1, with Connie easily leading on points. All this time Jock was barking the place down, and being little or no sort of use. However, when I left off for a breather, he tackled her on his own account, and had her out in 2 twos, and over back along the garden path towards the stable. I followed to shut her in. It was one of those beastly paths made of stones the size and shape of potatoes. I expect you know them. You slip about on them, and they hurt like billy-o. And I'd got slippers and thin socks on. Everything was perfectly foul, dark as pitch, and one of the worst rain squalls I'd ever been out in. The stable, garage, door was swinging open, and Connie went in of her own accord. So when she was safely in, I pushed the door nearly to and called to Jock to come out. But he wouldn't come. So I called him again, and, I'm afraid I rather reproached him for keeping me standing out in the wet. And as he still wouldn't come out, I went in to lug him out by the collar. He was in the far corner of the garage part, evidently very keen on something, and I put down a hand to see what it was. The first thing I got hold of was a shoe, with a foot inside it. Then I struck a match. It only lasted while the head was flaring, but it just showed me a woman's face, all over blood. And I said, "Oh, law!" Then I got hold of her wrist, and as there wasn't the faintest sign of a pulse, it was clear she was quite dead. Altogether, things were looking rather bleak. However, one couldn't just leave her there, and as no light would live for more than a second, she must obviously be moved into the house for further inspection. I managed to carry her out, and kick the door shut somehow, and went back along that perfectly bestial path, and eventually laid her out on the hearth-rug in front of the sitting-room fire. It had to be the hearth-rug, because it was the only bit of space that the rodeo with Connie had left anything like clear. And then I got a proper look at her. She was quite young, not more than 25, dressed in a long blue cloak thing, which I undid, and underneath found a clamorous yellow jumper and dark skirt. Also, of course, thin silk stockings and high-heeled shoes. She was wearing one of those absurd little hats, and as I've said before, her face was covered with blood. I took her hat off and hunted about for the wound, but funnily enough there didn't seem to be one. And then it suddenly struck me that it wasn't blood at all. I should mention that she was drenched through and through with rain. In fact, she couldn't possibly have been wetter if she'd been fished out of a pond. So, of course, the dye from her hat, which was bright red, had run down her face and made her look, well, like she did look. Somehow this seemed a little more hopeful, and when I felt her pulse again, I fancied there was a slight trace of something doing. But so faint one couldn't be sure, and there was certainly no audible breathing. However, I thought there could be no harm in trying a little brandy, seeing she wasn't bleeding after all. Her teeth were tightly clenched, so I poured a few drops into the corner of her mouth, like giving a dog medicine, and hoped for the best. Nothing happened, so I gave her a few more drops. As this didn't do any good, I increased the dose to a teaspoonful, and repeated it at intervals for some time. It was rather strange. One couldn't see her swallow, and yet the brandy seemed to get away somehow. At last, after what seemed hours, her pulse began to tick, and one could detect faint breathing. But she was only just alive, and deadly cold, in spite of the heat of the fire. Her clothes were actually beginning to steam, and that reminded me that the water evaporating out of her clothes was keeping her cold, and that she was safe for a go of double pneumonia, even if she did come round. So something drastic had to be done. You must please bear in mind that getting a doctor, or even help of any kind, was entirely out of the question. Firstly, because I didn't know where to go, and secondly, because the girl obviously couldn't be left. If she wasn't out of her sodden clothes into hot blankets quite soon, she'd probably die, which, all things considered, would be rather a pity. So, although it wasn't at all easy, by 10:30, well, the change had been effected, and she was rolled up in hot blankets, still in front of the fire, of course, and beginning to look a little less dead. Then I changed the treatment. Instead of neat brandy, I gave her half and half, brandy and milk. The milk was added because I had, because I couldn't help knowing that this utter collapse was due as much to her being half-starved as anything else. I even thought of beef tea, but I didn't know how it would get on with the milk. It was quite easy to give her stuff now, because her teeth had come unclenched. It didn't have to be so often, and in the intervals it was possible to do some tidying up. I hung her clothes to dry in the kitchen, and then set to work to get the camouflage off her face. This was most necessary. If she'd come round and seen herself in the mirror, she'd have had 40 fits. She had tons of stuff on her face, quite apart from the splodges of hat dye. Some of it yielded to soap and water, and some to salad oil, but it took turpentine to shift the hat dye. However, it did eventually come off, and allowed me to see her face. Of course, if all this had been an invented yarn, I should have made her out to be ravishingly beautiful, and goodness knows what. But as it is, I must confess, she was nothing to go mad over. Let's see, what was the next job? Oh, yes, her hair. I dried and brushed that. I tell you, if all else fails, I should apply for a job as a lady's maid. Quite nice hair it was, qua hair, but the colour rather beat me. At first glance it looked a sort of rich auburn, but about 5 millimetres from her head it was much darker, almost black. Perhaps she was what the Americans call a chemical blonde. I don't know. Soon after that she opened her eyes. She couldn't keep them quite in alignment, and it was rather a job to bring them both to bear on me at once. But she managed it, and then she said, "Hello, Wally." And I said, "Hello, how do you do?" And she said, "But you are Wally, aren't you?" And I said, "Never mind about Wally, you go to sleep." But not she. She started talking 19 to the dozen, and the most infernal rot. I thought for a moment that she was delirious. After all, it was only to be expected. But no, it wasn't that. It was something else. Oh, but something quite else. It was the liquor brandy. You see, she must have had, at the very least, well, over half a tumbler full, most of it neat, and on an empty, well, without anything to eat with it. And it had gone to her head. Of course, really, it was splendid. It meant she had enough stimulant on board to keep her heart going while I fed her. She managed 2 cups of beef tea. At least, I think it was beef tea. It was brown stuff out of a bottle. Of course, one had to be careful not to overdo it, for fear of making her of upsetting her. However, she wasn't. That is, it didn't. Hang it all, what I mean is that the beef tea perched all right, and did her a power of good. All this time she babbled on, and I let her. I remember thinking, "All right, my dear, you won't get another chance of getting squiffy on 1842 brandy, so make the most of it." And she did. She went on addressing me as Wally, and most of her remarks concerned an individual called Curly. Curly, it would seem, was a baggage man, whatever that might be, and he had got into her bad books by leaving her hamper at Taunton. It appeared, too, that Curly had still further earned her displeasure by omitting to tell her that a train call had been advanced half an hour. Altogether, he must have been a bad lad. Then, oh yes, there was a bloke called Props. She'd got her knife into him, too. He'd apparently been responsible for an alarm clock, which ought to have gone off at the end of the second act, but which had, owing to his carelessness, malice aforethought, or what not, gone off in the middle of a love scene, and boshed the whole blooming show. Of course, I didn't know anything about baggage men and propsies and train calls. That's because I've led such a sheltered life. But it was forced upon me that they were technical terms connected with a theatrical touring company, and that this young woman, unless my luck was right out, must therefore be an actress. It made me feel very proud. I'd never met one to speak to before. She then went on to prove it, that she was an actress, that is. She went through her entire part for my benefit. It wasn't very long, poor girl. She said, "Yes, mum," in the first act, and "No, mum," in the second. But from certain dark hints she threw out, she seemed to be understudying a sweet young thing who had a song and dance in the last act. She must be headed off from doing this at all costs. I mean, the blankets were all right, as long as she kept moderately still, but dancing was quite out of the question, and I told her so with much firmness, that she was to go to sleep like a good girl. Luckily she did, and it gave me a chance to go back and see if she'd dropped her bag or anything in the garage. As it happened, her bag was there all right, lying just inside the door, so I retrieved it and took it back to the sitting-room. My patient was sleeping quite peacefully, and there seemed no harm in trying to find out who she was, if she had any friends, and what she was doing on the top of Dartmoor anyway. So I went through the bag. It was sopping wet, like everything else, and to make matters worse, Connie had trodden on it. There was a sort of galantine inside, consisting of some press cuttings, keys, powder puff, a letter, some visiting cards, and so on. These were all firmly welded together with lip salve. It was an awful job, sorting this mess out into its component parts. The letter, which I read, began, "My dear Emily." The visiting card said Millicent, but let that pass, and was signed, "Your loving Aunt Sophie." There seems to be a familiar ring about that name, somehow. This particular Aunt Sophie lived in Brondesbury, and wanted her niece to go home and live with her, and chuck the fit-ups. Question, what is a fit-up? Answer, I don't know. Anyway, judging from the rest of the letter, Auntie was a very sensible woman. I was glad of the address, as it was somewhere to send this young person as soon as she was in going order again. Oh, I forgot to say that there was a purse in the bag too. No money in it, except 2 halfpenny stamps, and they were stuck together. In fact, all things considered, my patient appeared to be rather on her beam ends. At about 3, I had a bit of bad luck. A piece of coal broke in the tongs just as I was putting it on the fire, and it woke her. She wasn't quite normal, but she wanted to talk. So I let her tell her story her own way. It was very rambling, of course. It appeared that the No. 5 company she was touring with had come to grief at a place called Morton Hampstead. It wasn't a question of the manager decamping, but business had gone on getting worse and worse, and had finally petered out altogether. The company had been stranded without a bob amongst them, and they just melted away. This girl had got left behind somehow, and had started to walk back 10 miles to, whatever was that place? Well, anyway, it was the place where they'd been playing the night before. She thought that her late landlady might lend her the fare back to London. However, when she got halfway to, I wish I could remember that place. Short name, only 1 syllable. Begins with W. Oh, I've got it. Ashburton. Where was I? Oh, yes, when she was halfway to Ashburton, it got dark, and she took the wrong turning. I mean, instead of keeping straight on, she branched off up to the right. There weren't any houses or people to ask, and she kept on and on in the rain and wind, until she finally fetched up at the garage door. She didn't remember opening it, or falling down inside, nor did she know in the least what time she got there, having parted with her wristwatch a week before. There was a ticket about it in the bag, I remember. Altogether, she must have walked over 14 miles, the last 4 being uphill. The soles of her shoes were little more than brown paper, and she'd walked slap through both of them. She'd been half-starved for several days, and her last meal had been breakfast, and that had consisted of a cup of tea. It says a good deal for her pluck. It was a pity she had so few other good qualities, because she really was an astoundingly ordinary young woman. And no tact. A nice, sensible girl, might have been a bit curious as to how she'd been nursed, and so on, but she wouldn't have dragged all the harrowing details out of me like this one did. Yes, and when she'd got the whole story, she started slanging me. When she finished up by asking me where her reputation was, she'd like to know, I'm afraid I rather offended her. I said it was drying in front of the kitchen fire with the rest of her clothes. No, but it really was rather the limit. There was I, having had quite enough of it, and simply dying of sleep, and this unpleasant woman abusing me like a pickpocket. She got tired of it by and by, and dozed off again. And the next thing I remember was the Harrises coming back at 8 o'clock in the morning. They'd chucked their hand in when the storm got too bad, and had spent the night at a wayside pub about 8 miles out of Exeter. They looked a bit surprised when I showed them what had blown in, and I gave them a rough account of things, of course. Then Mrs. Harris took the job in hand, and I wasn't at all sorry either. To cut a very long story short, we kept that girl there for 3 days. She was thoroughly nursed up, her clothes were cleaned and ironed, she was fitted out with a hat and some shoes and stockings, and packed off to her aunt with a £5 in her pocket. I know it isn't usual to mention such things, but there it is. And do you know, she never even wrote to say thank you. Mind you, you mustn't think that we wanted extravagant protestations of gratitude, or anything of that kind, but we did think she might just have written a few lines. On top of that, about a fortnight ago, she sat down bang opposite me in the tube. She knew me all right because she blushed so. But she cut me dead. And that's why I've told you all about it. The 19 Club. I belong to a dining club. As a matter of fact, I'm the secretary. But apart from that, there's nothing much to distinguish it from lots of other clubs of a similar kind. It's called the 19 Club. You may think that sounds rather mysterious, but it isn't in the least, really. There are 19 members, and it was started in 1919, so I don't honestly see how it could have been called anything else. We are just a lot of people who had a certain job to do during the war, and when it was over, we thought it would be rather fun for us all to meet and have dinner together every now and then. So we do, twice a year, on June the 1st and December the 1st. When it falls on a Sunday, we make it the Monday. This arrangement saves the secretary a lot of work, as there aren't any notices to send out. In fact, being a secretary is no trouble at all. We always stick to the same restaurant, and I go in 2 or 3 days before and order the dinner. When it's over, just before we leave, I go round and collect 30 bob or so from everyone and hand it straight over to the head waiter. He gives me a receipt, which I generally lose, and there you are. Nothing could possibly be simpler from my point of view, or, you'd think, from anyone else's. But it was this very simplicity which nearly landed us in a mess on June the 1st this year. If you'll examine our somewhat casual procedure for a moment, you'll see that it leaves the management of the restaurant, and of course the waiters, quite in the dark as to who any of us are. Not that we care, for all they know is that we are the 19 Club, and they write it up on a card down in the hall. There's a highly polished mahogany board on an easel just inside the entrance, giving the names of the rooms, and they shove it on that. Well, by some mischance, a prowling journalist in search of prey wandered into the hall during our last December meeting, and he happened to see this card. He asked who we were, and the people down below couldn't tell him, because they didn't know. They said they had no information about us of any kind. This appears to have piqued his curiosity, and he promptly sent up his card, addressed to the secretary, asking for an immediate interview. A waiter brought it to me during quite an amusing speech that was going on, and I thought it was rather cheek. I just said no, or words to that effect, and would Mr. Heacham please go away. Heacham was the name on the card. I mean, the freedom of the press is all very well in its way, but if a few friends can't dine together quietly without reporters butting in, well, it's a bit too thick. However, Mr. Heacham did not go away. He seems to have hung about outside for the rest of the evening until we left, and then got the commissionaire at the door to point me out to him. I never saw him at all, but he must have followed me home, and then looked up my name in the directory, because 2 days later there was a letter from him. He wrote from some office in the Strand. He described himself as a freelance journalist, and said that he'd been commissioned by the editor of a well-known London daily to write a series of articles on dining clubs. Mind you, I never believe this story, because I think it's so much more likely that they write the articles first and hawk them round to the editors afterwards. But I may be wrong. He went on to ask for the names of all our members, together with any biographical details likely to interest the public, and so on. I believe he added that it would be a fine advertisement for us. At any rate, I called loudly for my stylographic pen and wrote him a letter, to which he made no reply, and there it was. But it only goes to show that some people don't like you to mind your own business. By the by, I made a statement a minute or two ago, which, I'm afraid, wasn't strictly accurate. I said that when this man's card was brought to me at the dinner, there was a speech going on. Well, actually, we don't have speeches in the generally accepted sense of the term. What merely happens is this. Supposing anyone does something clever or interesting, like flying to Australia and back, or motoring across China, or inventing something wonderful, we ask him to come and dine, and then afterwards he just gets up and spouts about it, describes his achievements in an informal kind of way. And we don't confine ourselves to respectable exploits either. If anyone were to break into the Bank of England and get away with £1 million, I'm quite sure we should ask him to come and tell us exactly how he did it. So you can see that in one way and another we do get a good deal of amusement and instruction, but we don't attempt to get it for nothing. Oh, no, there's an honorarium of 10 guineas, which we always hope the guest of the evening will accept. And we are getting more and more sanguine about its getting accepted, because no one's ever refused it yet. You'd be surprised at some of the distinguished people to whom a tenner hasn't come amiss. In fact, the man who pouched my furtive envelope with the greatest gusto was a certain Chancellor of the Exchequer. I shan't say who it was. He'd come along and explained his budget to us. It isn't anyone's job in particular to procure these artists, but we all keep our eyes open for suitable turns. At all events, last March I happened to come across a paragraph in the newspaper. It was tucked away in a corner, but it took my fancy very much. It was all about an Englishman called Kennedy, who'd escaped from a foreign prison. There's apparently a small island off the coast of Java, which the Dutch use as a convict settlement, and Kennedy was there, serving a sentence of 10 years. Well, whether they weren't kind to him, or he'd got tired of the place, I don't know, but one fine morning he decided to leave. He climbed over the barbed wire when no one was looking, and made straight for the house of the governor of the island. The governor wasn't in, so Master Kennedy went into his bedroom, put on one of his uniforms, and strolled down to the harbour. There he borrowed the governor's motorboat, and left the island flying the governor's flag. He even managed to extract a salute from one of our light cruisers, which was lying in the harbour at the time. After that, all trace of him was lost. I showed this paragraph to several other members of the 19 Club, and they all agreed that he was just the lad for us, if only we could get hold of him. It so happened that I knew the editor of the paper which had published the report, and I went round and asked him to let me know if he ever heard anything more. He promised to make inquiries, but he wasn't very hopeful. However, roughly 7 weeks later, I got a somewhat cryptic letter from a man in Chiswick. He said he was just back from the East, and understood that I'd been inquiring about a certain person whose name began with K. If I still wanted the information, would I please call at the address on his letter, number 23 something or other Gardens, and ask for John Smith. This I did that same afternoon. Something or other Gardens, and I'm not going to give the name, consisted entirely of red brick villas with apartments to let in the windows. The door was opened to me by an obvious landlady, quite a nice old thing, and when I asked for John Smith, she somehow looked as though she knew it was an assumed name. She said he was expecting me, but would I mind not stopping too long, as he'd been ill? I promised not to, of course, and then she showed me into the right-hand front sitting-room. It was typically but comfortably furnished. There I found a nervous little rabbit of a man, of about 35, who kept darting to the window and peering out into the street. He also had one of those high voices which have never broken. It was so pronounced that it was quite difficult to get used to. We discussed the weather until the landlady got tired of listening at the door, and he admitted what I'd already guessed, and you too, probably, that he wasn't John Smith at all, but John Kennedy, the escaped convict himself. He apologized for receiving me in such a hole-and-corner way, but he was terrified of the police finding him and handing him over to the Dutch. I said they'd get no help from me, and we finally got down to the business of the 19 Club dinner. He was a bit chary at first, of coming out into the open so much, but he eventually thought he'd risk it, and he brightened up quite a lot at the idea of a tenner. The only trouble was that he was what they call a bit pushed for the stuff, and he only had the clothes he stood up in. Could anything be done in the way of an advance? He was quite frank about his affairs. He'd had a bad go of flu soon after landing, which had left him with a flabby heart muscle and prevented him from looking for a job. He was in debt to his landlady, and altogether things weren't too rosy. Anyway, I was able to let him have enough to square his landlady and get some clothes, and I also told him I'd get the club to spring a bit more in the way of fee. I was most careful not to refer to his prison experiences, because he didn't seem up to it. So I gave him the time and place of the dinner, and came away. My only regret was that his voice was so singularly unsuitable for the recital of daring deeds. It would be as well, perhaps, to explain that to get to the room we dine in at the restaurant, you have to go through a sort of ante-room, and it is our custom to assemble, first of all, for sherry and cocktails in this smaller room. Well, on June the 1st, we were all waiting in this room when John Smith walked in. We'd arranged to go on calling him that in his own interest. He looked a good deal better in health than when I'd seen him last, but he'd evidently been fortifying himself against the ordeal of delivering his discourse. Not that he was at all screwed, but he had undoubtedly had one or two. It was a good thing he was a bit late, and that there was only time for him to have one glass of sherry before we went in. I also took the precaution of sitting next to him, and seeing that he didn't overdo it. It seemed mean, but it was no use him getting tight too soon. Anyway, dinner went off all right, and soon after the King, when the waiters had all cleared out, our chairman invited him to tell us about his experiences out east. He also gave an assurance on behalf of the club that nothing he said would go any further. Whereupon John Smith Kennedy got up and proceeded to tell his story. And a very astonishing story it was. He led off by saying that the crime of which he'd been convicted had been a burglary in Brussels, of all places. No one said anything, but most of us thought it rather peculiar for a man to be sent to a Dutch penal settlement for an offence, however heinous, against the laws of Belgium. He made other equally glaring mistakes too, and it soon became perfectly clear that the whole story was a pack of lies from beginning to end, and that he'd never been nearer Java than Southend. Things got so ridiculous that it was finally put to him that he was romancing, and he admitted it without any beating about the bush. He said he wasn't the man Kennedy at all, that he'd never been in prison, and that the whole thing was a hoax. We said, "Ha ha, very funny," and all that, but if you aren't Kennedy, who are you? And then he sprang his great surprise. You remember that man Heacham, the journalist who'd sent up his card and tried to find out about the club? Well, he was Heacham, getting a bit of his own back. I didn't see at first how he'd got hold of the Kennedy story in connection with us, but he explained with fiendish glee that he occasionally did work for my editor-man, and he'd actually been sent for and given the job of making inquiries about it. The editor must have mentioned my name and told him why I wanted the information. Needless to say, he hadn't traced Kennedy, but he'd used the circumstances to score off me and the club, and there was no denying that he'd done it jolly well. We shouldn't have cared 2 hoots if he hadn't been so beastly offensive. He strutted up and down and jeered at us, and that wasn't the worst. He was going straight along to the Daily Whatnot, and the whole story would be in the paper next morning, complete with such of our names as he knew. He got so truculent that if he hadn't been our guest, I'm quite sure someone would have slogged him on the beak. We told him that we didn't wish the story to appear in the paper, and should take steps to prevent it, whereupon he completely lost his hair, and got awfully excited. He said, "I'm still in the doctor's hands for my heart. If you offer me any violence, it'll be the worse for you." It was pointed out to him that no one had the slightest intention of using any violence, and I can't make it too clear that nothing which any of us said or did could have been taken as in the least threatening. We did, however, say that before we left we should like a few minutes to discuss the situation in private, and would he mind going into the ante-room. He did, and one of us went with him to keep him company. Well, the rest of us hadn't been talking for more than a minute, when the man who'd gone in with Heacham appeared at the door, and said, "I wish you fellows would come and have a look at this bird. He doesn't seem very well." So we all crowded in, and, my word, he didn't look at all well. He'd fallen forward in a chair, apparently in a faint or fit or something. One of our members was a doctor, and he examined him for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry, good people, but this is a bad show. The man's dead." And he went on to explain how a heavy dinner and over-excitement had caused acute dilation of the heart when it was a bit groggy, and it had snuffed out. Extremely simple, no doubt, from the medical point of view, but devilish awkward from ours. We were very sorry, of course, but at the same time we couldn't help feeling a little annoyed with this person for coming to the dinner under false pretences and then going and dying on us as well, so there definitely wasn't the frantic amount of sympathy which there otherwise would have been. It would be bound to get into the papers, and a tragedy like that always does a restaurant a certain amount of harm, and it would also mean that some of us would have to spend a merry morning in the coroner's court. So we were all standing about, looking rather grave, and putting our cigars down, when one man remarked, in a thoughtful kind of way, "What an awful lot of trouble it would have saved if only this individual could have survived long enough to get home." And then he gave a little nod, just like that. And, as everyone knows, a nod is sometimes as good as a wink, especially when it comes from anyone as high up in the service as he was. And his meaning was so utterly scandalous that I'm sure all of you will have grasped it. I asked him. I said, "Is it too late, sir, for you to get a game of bridge somewhere?" And he thought. No, it wasn't too late. He caught the eye of 2 or 3 more of similar rank to himself, and they all sauntered out. When they'd gone, we put our heads together and settled our course of action. We posted a man on the door to keep out stray waiters, and went and fetched all the hats and coats, including the unfortunate Heacham's. While we were putting his on, the man with the largest car was told to go and get it and send his chauffeur home. As soon as word came through that it was at the door, we got a move on. A sort of advance guard of 5 went on ahead to make a demonstration. They were to send all available commissionaires for cars and taxis, and generally clear the entrance of hotel staff. The main body, so to speak, followed a little way behind. This main body consisted of another man and me supporting Heacham, with the rest of the 19 Club in close formation all round us. We went down the stairs without the slightest check, all laughing and talking, though not feeling a bit like it. But when we got into the hall, we were confronted by a most appalling snag. They'd gone and rigged up the revolving doors. They'd been folded back out of the way before dinner, but I suppose it must have turned cooler during the evening. Anyway, there the brutes were, revolving away like anything, and we wondered how on earth we were going to manage. Perhaps some of you've tried going through those doors 2 at once. It's a bit of a squash at the best of times, when you're both of you alive, but you try it when one of you isn't, and you'll admit that it's no fun at all. We couldn't stop and confer without attracting attention, so our front rank went through and formed a screen on the outside. Then, as secretary of the club, I felt it my duty to be entirely responsible for our guest, and he gave me no help at all. When we were halfway through, and completely shut off from the outer world, his hat fell off. I had to retrieve it with one hand and keep him propped up with the other. The people who were turning the doors round saw and backed water to give me time, but it was a trying experience, and I'm quite prepared to swap nightmares with anyone. I didn't feel happy until we'd got him into the car, and even then, happy is rather an overstatement. Another man and I sat with him between us at the back, and there was just the owner in front, driving. He drove very carefully, too, because it wouldn't have done for us to run into anything, and all get asked for our names and addresses. Also, we didn't want to get to Chiswick too early. As it was, in spite of simply crawling the whole way, we found a light in the first-floor window, so we kept straight on. We came back in 10 minutes, but it was still there, and we drove about the district for the best part of an hour, passing the house at intervals, before it was put out. However, it finally was, and the last stage of our operations began. The car dropped us and drove off to wait a few turnings away. The other man and I carried our friend up the garden path and in at the front door. This was easy, because we'd got his key, but then we struck another bad patch. When I'd called at the house the first time, There'd been linoleum on the hall floor, but this had evidently been taken up, leaving nothing but bare tiles. There wasn't even a mat, and when we stepped onto those tiles, straight off a gravel path, you can imagine the row we made. Slate pencils weren't in it, and it woke the landlady. She came to the top of the stairs and called down, "Is that Mr. Heacham?" And I said, "Yes," in a very high voice. After all, it was. Then she said, "Your cocoa's on the kitchen stove." And I said, "Thanks very much. Good night." And she mercifully went back to bed. We then breathed again and got Heacham into his room and switched on the light. We took off his hat and coat and arranged him as naturally as we could in an armchair. I went along to the kitchen and fetched his cocoa and cup and saucer and poured some out for him. If we'd been his murderers, and we almost felt like it, we couldn't have taken more pains. But I should like to put it on record that from first to last he was treated with all due respect. We didn't forget to leave the light burning, and his own fingerprints were on the cup and saucer. We got away without a sound, picked up the car as arranged, and reached home without incident. There wasn't an inquest, or if there was, it didn't get into any paper, and everything must have passed off quite smoothly. But we had an anxious few days, all the same. We were anxious because I'd made one foolish mistake, as criminals often do. On the face of it, it was trifling, but even so, it ought to have rotted up the whole of our good work. I'd come away with Heacham's latchkey in my overcoat pocket. The Suitcase. Not very long ago, I had to go down to Plymouth to see someone about something, and I went by the 10:30 from Paddington. I got to the station nice and early and found my seat in the train. It was next to the platform and away from the corridor. It also faced the engine. Now you know all about it. While I was putting my bag on the rack, another man got in. He took the far corner seat from mine, that is, next the corridor, with his back to the engine. He was a very ordinary-looking individual, on the small side, with a little brown moustache. His clothes were brown too. Altogether, there was nothing very distinctive about him, except his suitcase. That was about 2 sizes larger than the usual ones you see, and it appeared to be rather heavy. He tried to shove it under the seat, but it wouldn't go, anything like, so he had to put it on the rack. It didn't look any too safe there either, but that was his funeral, or might be. Having done this, he departed, presumably in search of newspapers or drink. There was still plenty of time before the train went, so I got out too, and stood just near the carriage door and smoked. About a minute later, 2 people came down the platform from the front end of the train, the engine end, and they stopped at my carriage. They looked like a mother and daughter, the mother seeing the daughter off. The mother asked me which seats were taken, and I told her. It was no use trying to make out that they all were, as one generally does, because she could see they weren't. Besides, the girl was very pretty. So she, the girl, got in and took the seat opposite mine. Then the good lady took me on one side. I was still out on the platform, you understand, and she said, "Are you going to Plymouth?" And I said, "Yes." Then she said, "Well, I should be so much obliged if you would just keep a friendly eye on my daughter. She hasn't travelled much by herself, and we should feel easier in our minds, and all that. Of course, I said I should be only too pleased, and all that, but it did strike me as rather strange. If she'd been 15 or 16, one could have understood it, but she looked at least 20. However, it wasn't for me to complain. Well, time went on, and they began shouting, "Take your seats, please," so I got in and shut the door. The mother and daughter went on talking through the window. I promised the mother to do my utmost to keep her daughter out of mischief. She flashed me a smile, with a row of perfect pot ones, and the train immediately started. Of course, it would have started in any case. It was just then that I realised that my brown friend hadn't come back from buying his newspapers or having his drink. Perhaps he'd been left behind. But no such... that is, no, he hadn't. He came in from the corridor. He must have got on further back and walked along. He and the girl just glanced at each other as he sat down, and after that he began to read his paper. She, however, began to talk to me. She told me her name was Constance Collier. Not the Constance Collier, but just a Constance Collier. In fact, some Constance Collier or other. She explained this very carefully. I said I didn't think it would lead to much confusion unless she went on the stage. Just then the man in the corner caught my eye over the top of his paper and nearly made me laugh. I was wondering all the time why her ma had asked me to keep an eye on her, because she really did seem quite able to look after herself. And in any case, I shouldn't have chosen me if I'd been a ma. Well, she prattled on and told me all about herself and her likes and dislikes. She wasn't old enough to have a past, but if she had been, I'm sure she would have told me all about it. Then she began asking me about myself, question after question, on every conceivable subject. She'd have turned me clean inside out if I'd answered her anything like truthfully. As it was, I made a sort of exercise of it. After all, lying needs practice, like everything else. Then the dining car attendant came along. "Anyone taking lunch, please?" This raised the delicate question whether I was sufficiently in loco parentis to stand it her or not. I said, "What about it?" She said, "Thanks awfully." So I apparently was. As soon as we'd decided on the first lunch, the man in the corner said he'd take the second. Perhaps he wanted a little peace and quiet. When the time came, Miss Collier and I lurched along to the dining car. It's a funny thing in the train. People who were going to lunch looked more as though they were coming back, if you know what I mean. You notice next time. However, we did get there, and I wondered still more why she needed looking after. She opened with a gin and bitters. Then she managed her share of a bottle of Pommard, and had a yellow chartreuse to top off with, and never turned a hair. My opinion of her went up a lot. Also, she began talking quite sensibly. Back in the carriage, her endless chatter had seemed a bit forced. I'd thought she might be trying to impress the man in the corner for some reason. By the by, I happened to look up during lunch and saw him, the brown one, down at the far end of the car. He was talking to one of the attendants. I mentioned it to the collier. She had her back to him, and she surprised me very much. She said, "Please pretend you haven't seen him. I'll explain when we get back to our carriage." So I said, "All right." A few minutes later, when we got back, we found our brown man in his corner, just as though he'd never moved. He then went along to lunch in his turn. The moment he was well out of the way, my young woman jumped up and felt the weight of his suitcase up on the rack. Then she clapped her hands like a schoolgirl and said, "We've got him!" I asked her what she was playing at, and then she told me, or rather, she didn't. She dashed down the corridor towards the rear of the train, and came back with a man whom she introduced as her father, and another man whose name was... Oh, now whatever was his absurd name? I've quite forgotten it. Anyway, it doesn't matter in the least. They told me all about it. They explained that they were CID people, and that the man in the corner was a thief. His particular line appeared to be travelling in trains with restaurant cars, and helping himself to jewels and things during the luncheon hour. He carried a specially large suitcase, so that he could carry off an ordinary-sized one inside it. They'd been after him for months, but had never been able to catch him. They'd had detectives in the carriage with him, or just next door, over and over again, but he always seemed to know when he was being watched. So, finally, Collier had put his daughter on the job, and he and his fellow sleuth had travelled in the guard's van, done up in brown paper, or something of that kind. All Constance had to do was to note the lightness of his suitcase at Paddington, which she must have done when I was on the platform, and tip the wink when it got any heavier. It came back to me then how Brownie had pretended it was heavy, and had tried to put it under the seat, when he must have known it wouldn't go. Clever move, that. I said it seemed a grave interference with the liberty of the subject if a man's suitcase wasn't allowed to put on weight if it wanted to. Collier said it could if it liked, provided no one else's got any lighter. He told me they'd all been hanging about near his, Brownie's, lodgings for 4 days, ready to follow him anywhere. I asked where I came in, and they said I just had. They thought the girl would be less conspicuous if she was talking than if she wasn't. This idea was entirely theirs, so they told her to talk to me. All that remained to do now was to wait for the wretched blighter to come back, and then run him in. I said, "Why don't you open his bag and see for yourselves? You may be buying the most appalling pup." Oh, no, they couldn't do that. It wouldn't be legal, apparently. Besides, the bag was locked. They didn't even inquire whether anyone on the train had missed anything. So we just sat. Mind you, I didn't quite like it. It's not much fun watching a man walk into a trap, unless he's your enemy and it's your trap. That's quite different. But here it seemed rather cold-blooded, although I admit that the man had been very naughty, from all accounts. Presently people began staggering past from the second lunch, and then in came our friend. He was quite wonderful. He must have known it was all up, finding 2 extra men in the carriage, but he never even blinked. Collier said, "Come on, Gilbert, you know who we are." And Gilbert said, "Why, it's Mr. Collier. How do you do?" Wrung him by the hand. "Fancy meeting you." And Collier said, "Yes, fancy. What have you got in that bag?" Gilbert looked rather hurt. He murmured something about England being a free country. That was the only silly thing he said. However, Collier wasn't having any. He made it clear that if he didn't open the suitcase at once, he'd arrest him on suspicion of being in possession of stolen property. Then Gilbert looked still more hurt, and began to look for his keys. He felt in all his pockets about 4 times, and finally produced a huge bunch. There must have been at least 20 keys on it, and he tried them all before he found the right one. Then he raised the lid as slowly as possible, and showed us, with great pride, 8 bottles of stone ginger beer. He'd evidently gone along and got them from the dining car while we were at lunch, and the receipt was on top. He must have smelt a rat during the journey and thought he'd have a bit of fun. I will say one thing. Those 2 detectives were real sportsmen. They laughed as much as I did. We all parted the best of friends at Plymouth. Of course, they are bound to get him some day, but I hope that when they do, they'll make some allowance for his sense of humour, because Gilbert is a filbert. Private water. There's a man in the department where I work who's a great friend of mine, in spite of the fact that we share a room, and this story's all about him. He says he doesn't mind, but in order not to identify him too closely, I'm just going to call him Henry. It all began one morning a few months ago, when he staggered into the office with a huge great iron thing, like the wheel of a traction engine. I said, "What in the world's that?" He said, "Oh, didn't you know? I've had a country cottage given me, and this is the base of a petrol engine I bought to pump the water out of the well with, because it's too much fag to do it by hand." He went on to say that he wasn't going to use the iron base, as he thought a concrete bed would be better. Well, this was the first I'd heard of this cottage, because I'd been away on leave, but it was apparently somewhere in Norfolk, and it had been given him by his mother. He did tell me how she'd come by it, but I've forgotten. The point is that she didn't want it herself, so she'd passed it on to Henry. He was rather vague as to its exact location, as he'd only been down once by road, but it seemed quite a decent sort of place. It was furnished after a fashion, so he said, but it would want a whole lot doing to it, so they were going down each weekend and getting it into shape by degrees. As time went on, I naturally heard a good deal about how things were going. You do when you are in the same office as a man, and I couldn't help noticing that everything that could go wrong was doing. And when I say everything, I mean everything. It was almost uncanny. The most complete chapter of accidents happened in connection with the well, so I'll just quote it as an example. This well was bang in the middle of the lawn, and it looked quite decorative, but Mrs. Henry struck at the idea of installing a pump and a blooming great petrol engine alongside it. So what they decided to do was to sink the pump in the ground close to the well and stick the engine right away to the side somewhere. The engine was to transmit its power to the pump along a series of wheels and belts. These were to be down out of sight in a trench. Well, first of all, the concrete bed for the engine kept on cracking. The local builder must have got his quantities wrong. Anyway, he had to remake it 3 times before it would stand up to its job. Then one of the driving wheels in the trench was mounted slightly out of true, and every now and then its belt came off. This, of course, whizzed along and fouled all the other belts, and they said, "Let's all go down the trench," and the poor old pump got the lot. Then again, about the engine. It occurred to the Henrys that it would be bad for it to stand out in all weathers without a thing on, as it were, so they got hold of some matchboarding and felt, and built a sort of chicken house round it, and they tell me it looked very fine, but not for long. That completely disappeared. Someone must have come along during the week and taken it away. Even that wasn't the end of their hydraulic troubles. When they'd finally got the whole arrangement working and actual water was being produced, they thought they'd better have some of it analysed, and the answer was 3% of organic matter. Luckily, it turned out to be only a dead rabbit, but coming on the top of everything else, it did really look more than mere chance. I said to Henry, "Norfolk doesn't seem to want you. Whom have you been annoying?" He said, "We can't have been annoying anyone, because there isn't another house in sight," but he agreed that it was all very strange. However, by the middle of April, they seemed to have overcome the last of their troubles, and they went down and achieved a completely enjoyable weekend. But it was so quiet in the evenings that they thought a wireless set might liven things up a bit. Would I go down and help him install it? I said I would, and we all drove down on the following Saturday. We both had to go to the office in the morning. I forget why, and we didn't arrive until late in the afternoon. A perfectly gorgeous spot, but rather difficult to describe. Its position, I mean. You approached it down a long lane all overgrown with grass, which appeared to lead straight into a small river. But just before we took the final plunge, there was a gate on the right-hand side, and Henry said, "Here we are." His domain consisted of 2 cottages knocked into one, with a lawn in front, and past the bottom of this lawn flowed the river. At the back of the cottages there was a sort of barn place, which they used as a garage. I'm telling you all this because the general layout is rather important. First of all we had tea, and then I thought we'd better get the aerial up in case it turned wet. So we set to work. We didn't have to bother about a mast, because there was a convenient tree down by the river, but even so it took longer than we expected. Jobs like that always do, and it was pretty nearly dark before we'd finished. Just as I was beginning to climb down the tree for the last time, I noticed a light shining not far off, not more than a few 100 yards anyway. I thought it was strange, because Henry had said there was nothing within miles of them, so I called out, "What's that light over there?" Henry couldn't see it from the ground, and said, "What light?" But just then there were loud cries of dinner from the house, and the subject dropped. Afterwards we connected up the set and got quite good signals, even without a proper earth. All we had was a few feet of wire lying on the grass, but Mrs. Henry didn't like that, in case it got left there permanently. So Henry said, "All right, there's some wire netting in the loft over the garage. We could bury that. Let's go and get it." I murmured, "Must we?" But they didn't hear, and along we went with an electric torch and climbed the ladder into this infernal loft. We located the netting all right, but to get at it we had to move a lot of old planks and things, and underneath we came across a great long thing done up in canvas. We undid it, and it turned out to be a canoe, a Canadian canoe, complete with 2 paddles. This was a distinct find, although there was no saying what condition it might be in, but we said "Good-o," and lowered it through the trapdoor on chance. By the time we'd buried the wire netting, it was 10 o'clock, and we all went to bed. Now, I'm not used to going to bed at 10, and the result was that next morning I was wide awake at 6. I got up and looked at the weather. Not a cloud in the sky, or a breath of wind. I decided that it would be a sin to stay frowsting in bed a moment longer, and not only that. My room was next to the bathroom, and I was terrified that Henry might come along and sing in it, so I strolled down and had a look at the river, and that immediately reminded me of the canoe. I went and fetched it from outside the garage, and put it in the water, and to my great surprise it didn't leak. So I got in and paddled away downstream. Not that there was much stream, you could hardly tell which way it was flowing. It meandered about, like my stories, and after I'd gone a few 100 yards, and was meaning to turn back, I came to a place where there was a chain across. There was also a notice board, which said, "Private Water." That settled it. It was a perfect morning for trespassing, so I scraped under the chain and went on. No one seemed to mind, except numerous waterfowl, which got up and flew away, uttering piercing cries. I expect they didn't like the colour of my pyjamas. Evidently provincial birds. A minute or two later, the river took a sharp turn to the left, and led into quite a large sheet of water. By large, I mean about 1/2 mile long, and a couple of 100 yards wide. And it wasn't till then that it struck me that this must be one of the smaller Broads. Across the middle of this Broad there was a winding row of posts, apparently to mark the course of the river, but it occurred to me that it ought to have been able to find its way without that. Anyhow, I followed the posts and got through a narrow opening on the far side into a still larger river. By the way, before I actually went through the opening, I noticed a peculiar sort of hut standing near the edge of the lake. It had got a coke stove outside it, and, as far as one could see, the flue of the stove went deliberately in at one end of the hut, and came out at the other. Leaning up against the wall of this hut were several sacks, which I put down as containing coke for the stove. They were a bit light in colour, but perhaps they were young ones. And then I got through into the main river. A few yards downstream, immediately to my right, there was a large wherry moored against the bank. A wherry, by the way, is a sort of sailing barge, got up pretty. I hadn't spotted her before, because the river-bank was too high, and they'd taken the mast out of her. She was evidently there for keeps, from the look of her moorings, but lying astern of her was an extremely serviceable motor-boat. I should have liked to have gone on board her and had a look round, but hanging up in the bows there was a large flat fish, obviously maturing for bait, which was quite unapproachable, so I paddled frantically out of range and back to breakfast. Henry met me when I landed and said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've been to trace what that light was I saw last night." He said, "Oh, really? What was it?" Not a bit interested, and I said, if you must know, it was a piece of fish hanging up to ripen on board a motorboat out in the river there. He still didn't seem impressed. He simply said, I'm glad you've got back, because our infernal pump's gone wrong again. Putting it right took us until goodness knows when, but somewhere about 6, a small boy turned up from the outer world with a message about some eggs. He also mentioned that there'd been a mail van robbery in the neighbourhood the afternoon before. I immediately thought of my row of pale-coloured sacks. I said, Splendid! I can tell you where the swag is. And then I absolutely made them listen to my tale of adventure in the morning, and I put it to them. I said, why don't we go along in the canoe tonight and fetch one of those sacks and make sure? Well, Henry thought it would be quite a good scheme, so after dinner we went, just he and I. It was pitch dark, but you can always see on the water, and we got to the hut and found that the sacks were still there. We chose a nice fat one and solemnly carted it all the way back to the cottage. But when we opened it in the middle of the sitting-room floor, all we found inside was a whole lot of dried leaves. Rather a sell on the face of it, but Henry said, Yes, but what is this stuff? And we tried various things, and finally burnt a bit. That left no room for doubt at all. It was tobacco. Whereupon I had one of my brilliant ideas. I said, if I'm right, we are on to a far bigger show than a mail van robbery. That river over there is the Ant. The Ant runs into the Bure. The Bure and the Yare meet and run into the sea at Yarmouth. Now, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this fellow in the wherry goes in for smuggling. He starts off by making a reputation for himself as a fisherman. He can get to Yarmouth in an hour in his motorboat, and he goes in and out at all sorts of odd times, until no one ever takes any notice of him. Very well. As soon as he gets to that stage, he goes out every now and then, ostensibly after bloater, and meets another motorboat somewhere out to sea. This other motorboat may have come from Belgium, or anywhere you like, with a cargo of tobacco. He picks up this cargo and brings it back here, miles inland. In due course he puts it ashore at the foot of your lane, and it goes up to London by lorry. That's why everything's gone wrong here. He naturally doesn't want anyone living right at his back door. I admit that this seemed a hopelessly far-fetched theory, but how else could you explain 1/4 ton of tobacco in an out-of-the-way place like that? Anyway, we couldn't explain it, and then we began to get rather indignant. Not that we objected to smuggling per se. Why, I remember once coming ashore at Chatham so stuffed out with what my friends were going to smoke during a week's leave that they had to carry me on a stretcher. But that was different. It was wartime. However, this was a clear case of unfair competition with home industries, and we all had shares in the Imperial Tobacco Company, and we were just discussing what we ought to do about it when there was a ring at the bell, and lo and behold, it was a policeman. Mind you, this was hardly a coincidence. He'd been round the Saturday before, selling tickets for some country police fete, and he'd called about that. At all events, we said, "Come in, you're just the man we want." So we sat him down and gave him a drink, and then we produced the sack and said, "What do you think that is?" He just looked at it and said, "I know what it is. It's tobacco. Where did you get it?" So I started to tell him about the wherry and all that, and he said, "Oh, yes, that belongs to Mr. de Voyker, a Dutch gentleman. We know all about him." I said, "Do you also know that he smuggles tobacco?" And he burst out laughing. He said, "Smuggles it? He doesn't have to smuggle it, he grows it. He's got 16 acres under cultivation on the other side of the river. Didn't you see his drying shed?" And of course I had, only I didn't know what it was. Well, you can imagine how foolish we felt. Our Bobby was evidently conversant with the technical side of the business, and he went on to explain that the stuff we'd brought away was actually waste which couldn't be used, but it had to be disposed of in some particular way under the eagle eye of an excise officer, otherwise duty would have to be paid on it. Henry said, "Does that mean we've got to take this rotten stuff back?" And Robert was afraid that it did mean exactly that. The worst of it was that we should have to do it that night, because we were making a very early start next morning. So Robert was given what they call the other half, and duly seen off, and then Henry and I got into the canoe and paddled all the way back to Devoyker's shed with this blessed sack. When we eventually got back to the cottage, we found Mrs. Henry pacing nervously backwards and forwards on the lawn. She said, "I'm so glad you've come, because there's something funny going on further up the lane. The weirdest noises are being made." We could hear them ourselves, strange, odd crashes at regular intervals. So we went along to investigate, and found that it was friend Robert, still trying to get on his bicycle. Quite astounding. I thought policemen were like firemen, and that it didn't matter what you gave them, but they can't be. He was awfully pleased to see us, and said that if we'd only hold his bicycle still while he mounted, and then give him a push, he'd be quite all right. But I said, "No, my lad, I think not." I should hate to get a policeman into trouble, and there was no doubt that we were, in some measure, responsible for his unfortunate condition. That being so, we felt we ought to do the right thing by him. So while Henry was getting the car out, I brushed him down and found his helmet, and then we took him and his bicycle home. Next morning we all came back to London, I having had a most amusing time, so much so, in fact, that I'd brought away a little memento of it. As you may possibly imagine, I hadn't entirely swallowed the policeman's explanation of the sack of tobacco, and while the Henrys were seeing him off the night before, I'd had another look at it. The top layer certainly was rubbish, stalks and so on, but once you got down below that, the whole of the rest of the sack was stuffed tight with neat bundles of unbroken leaves, tied up with cotton. Well, I'd taken out one of these bundles and kept it, and when I left the office that evening, I went and called on my tobacconist. I plonked my bundle down in front of him and said, "What's that?" He proceeded to do various things to it. He first of all cut the cotton, and breathed on the edges. Then he fanned out the leaves and smelt them, and said, "That's very fine." I asked him what it was worth. He said, "Well, it all depends. Without the duty, it's worth about 6pence a pound, but with the duty, it's about 10 shillings. Isn't it iniquitous?" I next asked him whether it could be grown in England, and he laughed. He said, "Good gracious, no. That's the very best Virginia pipe tobacco. Can you get any more?" I said, "Yes, rather. The next dark weekend." The Dream. They've asked me to tell you about another of my experiences, and I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to try and describe to you a dream I often have. Before describing the dream itself, it may be as well to explain a few things about it. First of all, I've had it some 15 or 20 times altogether, at quite irregular intervals. Sometimes it gives me a miss for 2 years, at others it will happen twice in 6 months. There's no knowing. It began to visit me when I was 8 or 9 years old, and I used to think then that it was just the same dream each time, but it wasn't, and it isn't. The general setting, or locale, is the same, but there's a gradual moving forward of events, which makes it somewhat interesting, to me at any rate, and just a bit creepy. It always begins in exactly the same way. I am walking up a broad flight of stairs in a very large house. The carpet is dark blue and very thick, so thick that you sink right in. The walls are all white. The time, as a rule, is between 11 and 12 at night. It's evidently a party I'm coming to, and I'm rather late for it. My left forefinger is poking a piece of paper down into my waistcoat pocket, and I'm aware, in some occult way, that it's the ticket for my hat and coat. The whole place seems deserted, except for me. Not even anyone to take my name and announce me. In fact, I'm not rather late. I'm very late. At the top of the stairs there's a broad sort of landing place, and immediately facing me a very massive mahogany door with a large cut-glass knob. Through this door I go. In my very young days I used to have quite a job to push it open, but now it's merely heavy and solid. There's a screen inside the door which cuts me off from the rest of the room, and it just gives me the opportunity to pull down my waistcoat. I walk, with a certain amount of diffidence, round the screen. It's a great big room, very high and brilliantly lighted. The walls are white, and the carpet blue, like the stairs, and the furniture is very dark oak. The scene is rather peculiar. There must be at least 40 or 50 men in the room, and they are all sitting on chairs in front of a little platform against the far wall. They aren't sitting in rows, but just anyhow. It looks as though they've drawn up their chairs as near the platform as they can get. I expect that's what happens, really, but I've never got there early enough to see. They are all much of the same class, as far as general appearance goes, but their ages are widely different. They range from 20 or less, right up to 70 and more. I used to wonder, many years ago, what it was all about, but now I realize that all these people are watching, with very great interest, a conversation which is taking place between a man and a woman. Incidentally, she is the only woman in the room. These two are sitting on chairs, on the dais or platform. It's quite a low platform, really, not more than a foot high. I say they're watching the conversation because I'm sure that, unless one happens to be in the very front row, it isn't possible to catch more than a word here and there. The man on the platform doesn't call for any particular remark. At least, I don't know. It is rather funny about him. He is evidently just one of the audience who has been invited up, as it were, and I've usually seen him a few times before in the body of the room. But the thing is that once a man has spent the evening on the platform, he never appears again. Now we come to the lady. She is very beautiful, almost too beautiful to be respectable. In fact, if one didn't actually know... However, when I say respectable, I don't mean that she would faint clean away if anyone said damn, but one would hesitate before digging her in the ribs on short acquaintance. As far as I can tell, she's on the tall side, and very graceful. I've never seen her standing up. She looks as though she could dance well. By dance, I mean waltz, of course. She has lovely copper-coloured hair, and she's had the sense not to cut it off. She apparently believes in looking like a woman, and not like an ungainly boy. Most unfashionable. But then you must remember that this is a dream. She's usually dressed in a simple black evening frock and a hat. The hat is rather of I think it's called the turban type. It's a little difficult to describe. It's got a sort of osprey thing that points backwards and downwards, rather like the tail of the comet does. I think Miss Lily Elsie wore something like that in The Merry Widow, if she doesn't mind my dragging her in. When I say she's wearing a simple black frock, I mean one of those simple little frocks which you can pick up anywhere for 50 or 60 guineas. And it's never the same dress twice. While she's sitting down, she isn't having a perpetual struggle to make her skirt cover her knees. Not that I've any quarrel with knees, qua knees, but those rows of bony excrescences which stick out at you in the tube, well, surely some of them might be left to the imagination. In fact, if things go on, as they are doing now, one won't want an imagination at all. And then what? To go back to the lady's hat for a moment, I must confess that it rather beats me why she's wearing one at all, that is, because she must be in her own house. You can tell that from the way she behaves. I mean that she's obviously acting as hostess, and her manner is a treat to watch. She sits quietly in her chair, without looking as if she'd been spilt into it, and she doesn't fidget. She hasn't any of those irritating little affectations which one often sees. She doesn't drag out a repair outfit every 2 minutes and plaster a lot of stuff on her face. Perhaps she doesn't have to. I don't believe she'd even powder her nose in public. Oh, I know that on this subject I'm only a locust crying in the wilderness, but it is refreshing to see anyone who isn't ashamed of her complexion. I've mentioned before that the conversation, or whatever it is, between the good lady and the man on the platform is so quiet that I've never been able to hear her voice. But there's no doubt in my mind that it's the kind that anyone vulgar, who wished to be extra offensive, would describe as a retained voice. But he wouldn't be there, so it doesn't matter. I've racked my brains trying to imagine what on earth they can be talking about for such a long time. In the early part, she seems to be asking questions and getting very deferential answers. Perhaps she's applying some sort of test. Later on, it's more as though she is giving information or instructions, and he just puts in a word here and there. At about 12:30, she usually lights a cigarette. Between you and me, I think it's a signal, as much as anything, to tell all the rest of us that we can smoke if we like. Some of us do. Now, it's a rather funny thing about the time. More often than not, the place where I'm standing gives me a view of a clock there is on the mantelpiece. It's one of those clocks which pretend they haven't got any works, like the women of the present day. You know them, the clocks. All you can see is a sheet of plate glass with the figures and hands on it, and the hands go round in some mysterious way. This clock goes, and it's right. How do I know it's right? Let's see, how do I know it's right? Oh, yes, because it always indicates the time of about 1 hour after I've gone to sleep, and that may vary quite a lot. As regards the age of the lady, well, it's a little hard to say. In my extreme youth, she was about as old as an aunt. When I grew up, she seemed more like a sister. And now I'm blowed if I know how old she is. Early 30s, probably. It's rather unusual to grow past anyone. I think I said at the beginning that there aren't quite enough chairs for everyone, and those who come late, like me, have to stand up at the back. All the same, it becomes apparent every now and then during the evening that there is a vacant chair a little way in. It's always a mystery to me how this happens, because no one would ever seem to go out, only a blind man would. But when it does happen, one of the men at the back sort of tiptoes in and takes it. We just settle amongst ourselves who, like you do in the tube. That's all right. I'm getting out at the next station, you know. A man who has once sat down always has a chair after that, so you see there's a process going on all through the years, whereby everyone gradually works forward to the front, and eventually finishes up on the platform. It has often, undoubtedly, been my turn to take a vacant chair, but some instinct has always warned me not to. Even our hostess has noticed it, and she's occasionally looked at me as though to say, "Aren't you going to sit down?" But I've always half shaken my head and let someone else have it. The chair, that is. Then she has given a slight, very slight, shrug of the shoulders, and I felt rather ungracious and left it at that. I know now why I don't sit down, and I'll tell you about that presently. It's extremely difficult to give you the facts about this dream in their proper order, because there isn't a proper order, and it differs in so many ways from ordinary dreams. There are none of the mad things in it that you ordinarily get. The one I'm telling you about is so abnormally normal. The one constantly variable factor is the man on the platform, and it's rotten bad luck that I've always been too late to see how he comes to be chosen out of all the others. He was once just sitting down, but that's the nearest I've ever got. It used to strike me what a rag it would be if only I could recognise anyone there. After all, it stands to reason that all these other people must be dreaming too, and then we could compare notes next day. Well, one night the man on the platform was a rather famous man, whom I knew very well. When I say I knew him very well, I really mean that I knew his secretary very well, which is infinitely better, believe me. So next morning I rang her up, the secretary, and said, "I say, I wish you'd fix me up an appointment with the old man sometime during the day, because I want to see him very particularly." And she said, "I'm afraid you can't, because he was found dead in bed this morning." Wasn't it just my luck? Fearful hard lines on him, too, of course, but it absolutely dished my chance of finding out what the dream meant. However, the fates were kind. 3 or 4 years later, I again saw a man on the platform whom I knew perfectly well. His name was Ribblechick, but he couldn't help that, poor chap. He recognised me, too, and we grinned at each other, and I thought, now it's all right, he'll have heard her speak, and will be able to tell me what she is, if not who. So, next morning I trotted round. They lived quite near us, and will you believe it, the whole house was upside down. He, poor old Ribblechick, had been found dead in bed too. Heart failure, they said it was. Please don't think that I'm suggesting for a moment that it was anything but the purest coincidence that these two unfortunate people happened to die in the same way. But all the same, each time I dream my dream nowadays, and a chair does fall vacant, I still let someone else have it, and the good lady still shrugs her shoulders. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, as well as purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2025. Thank you for listening.